So, this is my complete and entire retrospective of Iron Man Armored Adventures in one place. I covered this show a little bit differently than some of my other shows on this channel, because this show really wasn't conducive to rhetorical analysis or video analysis like I usually do. It was far better suited to doing more of an overview and just reliving a show that I loved as a kid. And so I want to bring this to you now in its entirety as like a huge 3-hour long video for all of you all to fall asleep to. If you can't tell, I'm also a little sick, so this is kind of filling in for this second video for the end of this month. I appreciate you all, and I hope you all enjoy. Marvel is coming off of one of the best and most definitive versions of Iron Man in media, with Robert Downey Jr.'s interpretation of Iron Man seeing almost universal praise. So how do you capitalize off of this if you are Marvel? It's simple. You take the exact same formula you did with the X-Men. You take the characters, you make them teenagers, and you set them in high school. So, if you haven't gathered already, we're talking about Iron Man Armored Adventures. I thoroughly enjoyed this show growing up. I thought it was pretty good, even if the animation isn't as great as I once thought it was back in like 2009. And I think it's really worth taking a look at. The show typically will follow Anthony Edward Stark, i.e. Tony, and his group of friends as they navigate high school and just kind of the world around them as things go, being teenage superheroes. And it all has to start somewhere with episode 1, in which we are introduced to a 16-year-old Tony Stark who is living happily with his father working at Stark International. By this point, Tony is not in high school, he is homeschooled. He spends almost all of his time with his father since the death of his mother, and the two of them are super geniuses, for lack of better terms. They're constantly coming up with anything and everything to one-up each other when it comes down to making inventions and trying to progress through future technology. Tony is shown from very early on in this show to want to help the world. He doesn't want to make weapons. Almost everything Tony invents is going to be used for exploration, excavation, or to help save lives. But of course, there are people in Stark International who would rather see all of these developments go towards weapons as it's far more profitable, i.e. Obadiah Stane. But not everything is obviously going to go perfect. We gotta have a start to this show somehow, and that begins with Tony trying his best to show his dad his brand new invention, only for Tony to end up in an accident that would leave him both in need of a heart monitor and without a father. This is their origin for Tony. It was a rogue plane attack that landed him with the shrapnel in his chest that he needs the arc reactor to use to live. And on top of all of that, Tony is now no longer living at Stark International nor with his father. Tony is now living with his best friend Rhodey's mother, Roberta, who happens to be an esteemed lawyer, and Rhodey's dad is pretty much absent from the series as he's a military man. And when Tony does finally go back to visit Stark International when he's healthy, he sees that pretty much everything is different. Obadiah Stane is running Stark International almost like a complete weapons company. Everything is super professional, the employees do not seem to be happy, and in almost a comically evil takeover, everybody seems to be miserable and sad, and even the decor of just about everything in this area has changed, especially when it comes to the guards and the way they dress as well, to be more intimidating. Tony, of course, is not very happy about almost any of these changes, and from what we are shown, especially early on in this show, Tony has a temper. He is only a 16-year-old, and he is kind of unruly. He is very temperamental, he is arrogant, just as always, but he also does, at the end of the day, have a decent heart, and of course wants to see what's best for his company and his employees, and he doesn't think Stane is that. But he would have to wait 2 years, as Tony can't take over until he is a legal adult at the age of 18. So he has to sit back and watch Stane pretty much destroy the entire identity of the company that his father had built and Tony had been semi-helping run since he was a little boy. This obviously leads to a very frustrated Tony.
Hey, how'd it go? Never mind.
And to make everything worse, Tony is finally forced to go to high school. He's no longer being homeschooled and now has to deal with the public education system. I truly feel sorry for him. Now, obviously, Tony Stark is a genius, and he doesn't really value school almost at all, especially because most of it is pretty below him. And when Tony is offered a free period, he just kind of goes to the roof and hangs out, as he knows absolutely nobody at this school other than Rhodey. And in this alone time, we see that Tony is almost completely hyperfixated on his company. He is hyperfixated on the loss of not only his father, but the loss of what he once had. We are shown what Tony had to go through after the plane had crashed. We are shown that the only thing that kept Tony alive throughout all of this entire situation was the armor that he had built. Tony had built this armor as a search and rescue design, so it was built for extreme conditions, and it was built to not only keep the wearer safe, but as well built to save others' lives. So of course, Tony would look to that as being his first and last resort, especially in a situation like this. And while Tony was having this little trip down memory lane, we're introduced to our third and final main cast member, that being Pepper Potts. She is almost like a manic pixie dream girl tomboy in this show, and is often used for comedic relief, and is one of my favorite characters personally in this show. Now, with the main cast introduced, and of course, Tony finally getting out of his regular high school day, we are shown the Armory. This is the place where Tony will keep just about every single one of his inventions and Iron Man armors while he is not off, saving the world or at high school. Now you must be wondering, how does Tony afford all of this in high school? Well, apparently he still has access to his trust fund, although I don't know how that works considering he doesn't have any access to anything company related until he's 18, but he does have the access to his trust fund. And Tony's whole idea behind having this armory and behind using this armor, he wants to spy on Obadiah Stane. He wants to use his tech in order to try and help his company as best as he thinks he can, which in this position would be spying on Obadiah. But at the same time, the show also introduces the idea that Tony has to recharge the implant on his heart every 24 hours, and that the suit is going to drain a decent amount of power from the implant on his chest. And so Tony suits up for the very first time that he has ever done, all with Rhodey being his guy in the chair. And honestly, it's a really well done sequence. I think it's the best the show looks, is when Tony is in fluid movement with his armor. And of course, because this is a superhero show, while Tony is using his armor and taking it on a test flight, a rogue train is going to go land and hit Stark Tower, potentially killing every single employee inside if the train isn't stopped. And so obviously, Tony has to stop the train. So of course, Tony tries to stop the train with varying degrees of success, especially when his implant on his chest is slowly dying and draining all battery in an attempt to keep the suit powered, because yes, the suit does run off the exact same power that's keeping Tony alive. This will become a recurring plot device. And of course, like always, Tony is finally able to stop the train, and he's finally able to save the day. And it's this experience of using Tony's technology to save people that would go on to shape his character for the rest of this show.
My dad always wanted to use technology to help people, to save lives. And that's what I'm gonna do. That's what Iron Man will do. I'm gonna save Stark International from itself.
So that was episode 1. Now, because of the nature of this show and how interconnected every single episode is, I'm going to cover every episode, except it's just going to be with varying levels of detail. So if I don't think something is important, or if I miss your favorite moment, I'm sorry, but I had to cut it for time, as this video is long enough as it already is. So with all that established and set up, it's time to head into episode 2, which is characterized by the arrival of the Mandarin. We typically begin each and every episode with a cold open, and for this one, Tony is once again spying on Obadiah Stane. He is trying to understand what Obadiah is doing, and obviously try to stop whatever plans Obadiah has in order to use his technology as a weapon of sort. But of course, because Tony has been going around the city and saving people, he has garnered the attention of the media, who love to play cat and mouse with him. When we get back to the armory, we see Tony and Rhodey are having one of their, what's going to be fairly common arguments, in which Tony basically has not been showing up to high school on time or just not going at all, simply because he would rather spend his time being Iron Man and either saving lives or trying to find a way to take Obadiah Stane down. And of course, Rhodey is kind of getting sick of covering for him, especially if he's just going to race helicopters every morning before school. Also worth noting, in this episode, we are formally introduced to Happy Hogan, who will be one of my personal favorite recurring characters in this show. Now, during Tony's morning spy session, he had overheard that Obadiah was going to use his Earth Movers as gigantic living laser type weapons. Essentially, Tony had designed these Earth Movers to excavate areas specifically for looking at ancient ruins without hurting any of the environment or any animals. Now, Obadiah Stane, of course, thought, well, gee, how can we use this for the military? And of course, Tony now wants to stop Obadiah from using his technology to potentially harm people. So Tony, in his infinite wisdom, decides to skip school once again to go check on these Earth Movers and just understand exactly what Stane has done to them in order to turn them into weapons. And unfortunately, he gets the ire of Stane as they are on the Stark International testing grounds. And while Tony is busy getting hit by these Earth Movers, we're introduced to somebody very important in the show. That would be the Mandarin. You see, Tony's dad, Howard Stark, had been digging up what he believed to be Makan ruins. Essentially ruins that held these rings that are of various powers and potential abilities. Tony's father perceived them to be advanced technology, but to us it looks very much like magic. Now the Mandarin has come searching for Howard Stark's ring, which just so happens to be in the possession of Obadiah Stane. And so Iron Man is trying to figure out how to destroy the Earth Movers because they're quite literally going to blow up the city due to having unstable power cores. Obadiah Stane is busy getting robbed by a dude in an all-black suit who looks pretty cool in my opinion. And for good measure, we're treated to, in my opinion, one of the coolest scenes in this entire TV show, which is kind of funny because it's like the second episode, but regardless, Tony does end up saving the day and destroying the Earth Movers by absorbing their energy. But this episode is far more important for setting up the conflict between Tony Stark and the Mandarin, as that will be the main overarching focus of this TV show, as it's set up almost like an episodic adventure with long strings of connecting plot lines throughout. Oh, and Obadiah Stane offers Tony a job as his bodyguard or whatever. I think that's a kind of like a nice little reference to the fact that Iron Man used to be Tony Stark's bodyguard in the older comics, but regardless, Tony says no. And we end the episode getting to know just a little bit more about the Makan rings and who the Mandarin is.
The man in black, the Mandarin, he had my father's Makan ring. What he did, the energy he produced, I don't know how to explain it. My dad was right, Rhodey. These rings, what if they are some form of technology?
And we are shown at the end of the episode who the Mandarin is, which I kind of didn't mention earlier, but it is revealed that Gene Khan is the Mandarin, leader of the 10 Rings, and he's imprisoned his uncle, the old Mandarin, and nobody knows that Gene Khan, who's like 16, is running this whole organization. And that is a pretty nice segue into episode 3, which is going to involve Tony Stark meeting Gene Khan, all in the event of trying to figure out how the Makan rings work and potentially where to find more to prevent the Mandarin from getting more of them than Iron Man has, which is kind of ironic, but neither of these characters know who is who at this point. And of course, when Tony doesn't get the immediate answers he wants from Gene Khan, he leaves him with a couple notes and enlists the help of both Pepper and Rhodey in order to get them to read Mandarin Chinese books, translate them, all in the attempt of looking for some Makan readings or just about anything that might mention Makan rings. And while they're doing that, Gene Khan decided to enroll in the same high school that Iron Man goes to, which is kind of ironic, but he did it on purpose because he believes that Tony Stark is his best bet at finding more Makan rings himself, as Gene struggles to find any. Oh, and they pair Jean and Happy together, and it's one of my favorite duos in this show. Now, Tony actually stayed in school this time and didn't blow it off, and spent almost a majority of his day translating Mandarin, and as well getting some help from Jean Khan. Now, it is worth noting that nobody on what would become Team Iron Man trusts Jean Khan at all except for Tony. Rhodey doesn't trust him, and Pepper for sure does not trust him, as Pepper's dad is an FBI agent, and Jean's uncle is on the FBI's watch list for potentially running a gang, which he does. And in Tony's infinite wisdom, and in a bid to get to know Jean Khan better, he tries to tag along with Jean along with Pepper, and the three of them end up getting kidnapped by the Magia. Now obviously Jean is being kidnapped by the Magia because his uncle is the head of the Ten Rings gang, but obviously Jean doesn't want to say this, nor does Pepper or Tony know that at all. Now, the rest of this episode's main importance to the stuff I'm going over is it's the first introduction of remote control of the armor as demonstrated in this episode, which will become more important later, and as well, it is our introduction to Jean Khan and Tony Stark's relationship. Also our first introduction to Killer Shrike and Unicorn, two recurring villains, and as well, it also gets both Pepper and Jean Khan to bond and to trust each other more, as Pepper does find Jean far more amicable, considering Jean basically saved her life in this episode. And with Tony making new allies in the form of Jean Khan and things of that nature, we're shown that he pretty much puts his blind faith into anybody and everybody who he thinks will help him. Tony sees that there is an issue going on at Stark International early in the morning, well before school, and what the problem is it's summer, but it is quite literally snowing outside. And what he finds inside is a man who happens to be wearing a suit of armor much like himself, except this suit is used for freezing just about anything in his path. Who Tony meets is Blizzard, a man who wants to get revenge on Stain for what Blizzard tells Tony is a failed malpractice in science. Essentially, he was working on projects for Stain, and in the process, Stain framed him and then basically got him arrested and made him lose his family. This is the story that he feeds Iron Man, and of course Tony eats it up immediately. He is looking for almost any ally in the fight in his mind against Stain, and he of course is extremely empathetic to the fact that Stain might have just ruined this guy's life, much like Tony believes he is doing to a majority of people working at the company. And Tony really does just put his blind faith into this guy, and I think part of it is simply his hunger for revenge against Stain, which is going to be a recurring theme, especially throughout this first season.
This is awesome, Rhodey. He calls himself the Blizzard. I should have known I'm not the only one ticked off at Stain. I think Blizzard hates him more than me.
Yeah, about that. Did something seem a little off to you about Blizzard?
Rhodey, for at least right now, is going to be skeptical of Blizzard, and I think that is a good way of looking at it. Tony is blinded by the fact that he might finally have an ally in a fight that he feels like he is never winning, so Rhodey has to, as a majority of the time throughout this show, act as a voice of reason to help offset Tony in this TV show. Oh, and it's worth mentioning we get a pretty funny scene where Tony pretty much just absolutely misses class by an entire hour after promising Rhodey he'd be there on time. Rhodey and Tony spend a majority of this episode arguing ideologies. Essentially, Rhodey does not believe that Blizzard, aka Donald, is a good person. He thinks that Blizzard is only out for revenge and nothing more, and that he is simply just fueling Tony's want and need for revenge at the same time, and using him to further his own gain, where Tony is basically so absorbed in his single-minded thought process that he doesn't believe that there is any problem with him helping Blizzard in order to take down Stain, even if the methods Blizzard uses aren't exactly on the up and up. And so Tony once again blows off Rhodey and blows off school, all in an attempt to help Blizzard find the pieces necessary to help him build a device that is supposed to destroy Stain's facilities, but in all reality it's a gigantic weapon that Blizzard plans to use in order to hurt a lot of people, specifically anybody who works for Stain, as Blizzard basically tries to kill these people indiscriminately, much to Tony's unfortunate revelation. Not to mention that Rhodey has been having Pepper, in the background of this entire episode as the B-plot, basically research on Blizzard and find his real name in the FBI database, only to find out that this man is nothing more than a con artist who happened to get burned by Stain because Stain had to fire him once it was found out that he was doing things that are illegal. Now obviously Stain knew he was doing things that were illegal, but obviously to save face as a company head figure, once it was exposed, he had to be fired. And by the time Tony figures all of this out, it is a little too late, as he has basically helped Blizzard get all of the parts needed to make his weapon, and unfortunately, Tony is left blindsided by this. Which of course leads Tony to being extremely frustrated. He blew off Rhodey, who was his closest friend, and ignored him simply because he thought he might have the chance of a new ally.
Rhodey was right about Blizzard, he was right about everything.
You forgot that I'm better looking than you too.
Now, as is the case majority of the time in this show, Rhodey obviously takes it in stride. He's almost always one of the characters who's going to take the high road, and of course, Rhodey's also one of the characters to give pep talks in this show, especially when somebody is feeling down. And he does the exact same thing for Tony. He is truly his best friend. This, of course, gives Tony the motivation to go back and defeat Blizzard and keep him from quite literally killing a lot of people at Stark Tower. Oh, and to finish off the episode, Tony totally did promise Pepper that he'd go to Happy Hogan's birthday party, and Tony regrets that very quickly.
And by better idea, I mean horrible idea.
Episode 5 is really all about fleshing out Pepper as a character and giving her some of the spotlight of an episode, as well as showing off how absent-minded Tony can be as a friend. To start the episode, Pepper's dad, who is an FBI agent, is on the tail of somebody called Mr. Fix-It. Fix-It is responsible for gearing up all of the supervillains throughout, whether it's this show or, as the FBI say, just random people. And he has entailed the help of his own creation, Whiplash, an assassin that Mr. Fix-It uses anytime somebody's getting too close to him, and in this case it happens to be Pepper's father, who ends up being maimed by Fix-It. Now, while all of that's happening, Tony is busy and hard at work, not showering, and making brand new armors, all in a bid to stay ahead of the game when it comes to the villains he's facing, as he's faced quite a few at this point between Blizzard, Killer Shrike, and of course, Unicorn. Now, while Tony is busy doing this, he has basically blown off Pepper, who has sent the dude like 92 messages and probably 60 calls. It's a running gag throughout the show. And of course, when Tony does get to high school, Pepper tries to talk to him about the fact that her father is not only in the hospital, but potentially facing death. And Tony essentially blows Pepper off completely in the event to go do whatever else he wants to do, specifically to help make armors. And Pepper is extremely frustrated by this. She, of course, wants to express how she's feeling to one of, if not her only closest friend in high school, and considering that he is blowing her off, Pepper feels completely miserable about all of this, and she is rightfully so extremely frustrated with Tony. And by the time Tony actually figures out that Pepper's dad is in the hospital, she is far too angry and upset with both of them to even answer a single one of their questions, and instead she goes off on her own to try and figure out who tried to kill her dad, because she obviously wants to get revenge. Pepper does have this little quirk where she believes she's going to be a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and some unknown badass, but you know, it's a kid's cartoon, so I'm just gonna let it slide, but I find it pretty funny. Now, obviously, Pepper's attempts to go super soldier spy didn't work out almost at all. She calls Rhodey in a panic, as Mr. Fix-It is sending assassins after her in order to quite literally kill her and do her the same way that was done to her father. And so Tony suits up and finally goes to save her.
My dad was investigating a guy called Mr. Fix, some kind of, inventor. He's a high-tech arms dealer. He supplies guys like the Magia.
And I really wanted to talk about this episode, not because it fleshes out Pepper as a character, gives her more to do, and we get to see more sides and more depth to her character, but it also is the episode that Tony finally reveals his identity to Pepper. Yes, about 5 episodes deep it takes for him to reveal his identity to one of his closest friends.
How long have you known?
I didn't! Oh man, but I do now! I can't believe you're really Iron Man! And I can't believe you fell for that.
Now, obviously, to anybody else, this would be a huge thing that their best friend is a superhero and didn't tell them, but Pepper, because of her personality, pretty much just accepts it and is kinda just cool with it. Which I kinda liked, because I'm never a big fan of the whole, you didn't tell me you were a superhero type drama, but that's just me. Although, unfortunately, Mr. Fix did track both Pepper, Rhodey, and Tony all the way back to where Rhodey lives at his home, and by extension where Tony's armory is, although, oddly enough, they didn't put 2 and 2 together that Tony Stark is Iron Man. But regardless, we also get introduced to my favorite one-off suit of the entire show. That being the Silver Centurion-inspired armor, which quite literally was made for dealing with Whiplash, and only appears in this episode, unfortunately, because it's a really cool looking armor. Regardless, this is the episode where we see Team Iron Man actually come together and be formed in their entirety, that being Tony Stark, Rhodey, and Pepper all as one set team.
I would have totally helped you fight crime weeks ago. Oh, we should be fighting crime right now!
Pepper!
Sorry, but seriously, why didn't you tell me?
I've tried to tell you 1,000,000 times, but you won't stop talking long enough to let me.
And I think the first episode that has the entirety of Team Iron Man does a really great job of showcasing each person's strength. So at the start of the episode, Tony is once again blowing off his schoolwork to save the day. Obviously, he needs to save these people because no one else will, but at the same time, he did promise both Rhodey and Pepper that he would help with their science experiment, which kind of needs to get done, otherwise it'll be made of clay and baking soda, but Tony's a little bit too busy doing the whole superhero thing, much to Pepper's dismay.
Clay and baking soda!
Now, of course, what Tony is distracted by is what looked like a meteor hitting New York, and what it turns out to be is a giant mechanized suit of armor, one that might rival Tony's, being quite literally flung from space into the atmosphere, and this thing is looking mean. Now, Tony doesn't even really try to be nice to this machine, he doesn't know what it is yet. He just kind of tries to stop it while making a couple terrible jokes, akin to like Spider-Man, for example. And when that doesn't work, Tony of course tries to assault the machine, and that goes about as well as you can think, considering the machine is almost triple Tony's size. He does absolutely nothing to it. And so after he gets the snot thoroughly beaten out of himself, he asks Team Iron Man for a different kind of help, choosing to try to tackle this in a more cerebral way, less than a pure physical one. And so Pepper is off to try and find any information she can on Pegasus. We find out that Pegasus is a scientific research company known for experimenting mostly with energy. Essentially, they had sent Ivan Vanko to space to do management and to understand the solar rays better and to better understand the sun. Now, in doing this, Ivan strayed too close to the sun, and because of a miscalculation, he ended up stranded in space for years. And of course, the man leading the project, Anton Vanko, decides that there isn't enough resources to go and venture to get Ivan and instead abandons him there. Now, Iron Man learns all of this as Ivan Vanko, who is operating what is known as the Crimson Dynamo armor, has basically showed up to Pegasus in looks of revenge for basically being stranded in space and being left without his family. Now, obviously, Iron Man doesn't want to have anybody die, and so he tries his best to hold off Ivan Vanko, all while Pepper is going to attempt to find his family, all in a bid to calm Ivan down, as Iron Man pretty much knows he stands zero chance fighting the Crimson Dynamo armor, as it is far too advanced and far too powerful. So instead, Tony has to rely on Team Iron Man in order to help him solve the problem. In the end, Ivan Vanko is reunited with his wife and his kid, and oddly enough faces absolutely no criminal charges for everything that has happened, probably on the basis of psychosis, because dude was left alone in space for, I think, a year. And now it comes time for Tony to help his friends with their science project, of which he doesn't because he falls asleep in his suit once again. Classic Tony avoiding schoolwork. Now, one thing I love about this show is that even innocuous background characters or little details that you think might not matter always have carryover. For example, Tony's pretty much been blowing off school a majority of the time throughout this show. Heck, he's in class right now and he's not even paying attention. He is too busy listening to radio reports for any sort of incidents at his school. And while doing all of this, his grades are suffering, and that is going to come to catch up with him in this episode, especially when one of his closest friends, Pepper, is unfortunately going to have to rely on him for another school project. But Tony doesn't have time for that, nor does he really need school. There's a case of somebody using stolen technology in order to make the world a less safe place. So of course Tony goes to deal with that instead. As it turns out, Tony is faced with somebody who has a piece of his father's technology, and then this technology was essentially going to be used as a teleportation device, but the technology wasn't anywhere near close to being finished, and so the wearer is essentially a walking time bomb of energy. And of course, the person wearing the suit doesn't know this, but Tony does because he understands the technology. So of course, Tony, knowing what's going on, is just taking the piss and essentially making fun of the dude while he beats him by the time Tony figures out how to. Now obviously Tony is extremely frustrated by the fact that his dad's technology seems to keep finding its way into criminal organizations as the episodes progress, and he wants to blame Stain for this, for opening what his father used to call the vault, in which he would keep all of his secret technology. Unfinished tech, to be specific, dangerous technology, and Tony demonstrates more of his anger and just genuine disdain for this type of thing. Now, unfortunately, Tony's rant and need to figure out what's wrong comes to an end when Roberta confronts him about the fact that Tony is flunking out of high school. He's a genius who just doesn't care about it. And so to motivate him, she plays him a clip of his father.
Tony, too much money and power can be overwhelming for anyone, even someone as special and gifted as you. I can't let you go down the wrong path. And if you're going to take over Stark International, you'll have hundreds of employees' lives in your hands. Learn to have a normal life, Tony, with balance. You need to have friends, to go to school, to learn all the things I couldn't teach you.
Howard basically had left Tony a speech in case he was struggling with the normal life that he was trying to be given, as normal as a life as Tony could have, in that Tony has to graduate from high school. He is required to graduate from high school, and he is required to live a mostly normal life, all in a bid on Howard's part to try and make a more well-rounded Tony, in order for Howard to try and leave a more well-rounded person to run his company. And of course, this frustrates Tony to no end, because his father's tech is being stolen, Obadiah Stane has turned his father's company into a weapons manufacturer, and he just can't fathom the fact that he has to deal with being in high school, because it's beneath him intelligence-wise. This leaves him frustrated and extremely angry, and like always, shunning the people closest to him. But eventually, Tony does come around to the idea of being a more studious student. He actually takes time off from being Iron Man and from saving people in order to study for school, specifically the classes he's bad at, such as theater, and actually showing up to and staying in classes throughout the entire day. He becomes an active participant, all in the event to make himself better at what he's doing, and to secure the fact that he will in the future be leading Stark International. Now, all of this, of course, gets cut a little short when what we now know as the Living Laser to come back out of the woodwork and challenge Iron Man because Iron Man had made fun of him. Yeah, Tony kind of is so great at creating his own problems, and this kind of reminds me of Electro's whole motivation for wanting to fight Spider-Man in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but that is, like, besides the point, I guess. Tony, as per usual, is able to defeat the Living Laser by locking on to his frequency and blasting him off into space and basically dust, hoping that Tony didn't kill the Living Laser and just made him into a ball of energy. All while Tony is just in time to make his play, of which he did not memorize because he was too busy being Iron Man. But part of the balance is that maybe sometimes you should be rewarded for doing the right things, even if you have to do something wrong in the process, like cheating on a theater assignment. And honestly, I don't blame the dude. Remember how I said every single episode kind of leads in a plot thread to the next episode? Well, this one isn't super important. It is there to show two things: evolution of Tony's tech, as well as show what Obadiah Stane is doing with Howard Stark's vault. As Tony Stark develops his first stealth tech suit of the entire series, all in a bid to see what Obadiah is doing with the vault, only to find that his father's vault is completely cleaned out, and all of the technology that was being held there is gone. Now keep in mind, this is all prototype technology that is dangerous. And before Tony can get out of there after seeing what was going on, his entire suit fails because the power consumption needed for the stealth tech completely drains the suit dry. And if it wasn't for the help of Whitney, who happens to be Obadiah Stane's daughter, Tony most definitely probably would have gone to juvie for this whole act, as he has to ditch the suit and try and get it back before they find it. And thankfully, for whatever reason, probably for the fact that Tony's cute and Whitney likes to piss off her father, Whitney pretends to have invited Tony to hang out. Now, of course, though, this means that Tony's Iron Man armor, his Mark I, his one and only, is stuck inside of a vault inside of Stark International, a place he can't really get to easily. So Tony has to figure out a way to get his suit back. And of course, that means it's time for our children's cartoon Heist of the Week. I personally really enjoy these types of episodes, but basically Tony goes on convincing his old assistant, his father's old assistant, to get a signature from Stane, while Pepper convinces the principal of the high school, and Rhodey gets a couple other people on board, including the main teacher of science and robotics at the school. Oh, and Tony has to also pay off Happy, because Tony's technically not allowed in the building as he's banned by Stane, and Happy just doesn't really care to go inside for this field trip because I think he was low grades. So Happy agrees to be a distraction for Tony in exchange for getting all of his homework done. And the heist goes off with a lot of hitches. It did not go well, but in the end, Tony did get his Iron Man suit back after swapping the power cells, and ended up on the bus well before Stane arrived there to keep his cover maintained, and shout out Happy Hogan for being the best bro and keeping his secret safe.
Yo, cue ball! Can't you see we're busy? Stark's been helping me with my homework all morning.
You were inside the building. There are hundreds of security cameras. I'll find out.
Sir, the hard drives crashed when the power went out. All of today's surveillance video, it's gone.
But it didn't all really end flawlessly, because Tony's armor may or may not be on top of the school bus, so they make a joke about having another heist off screen. Okay, so if you remember earlier, I was speaking on the Makan rings, Gene Khan, and the Mandarin. Well, in the background of just about every one of these episodes, Gene and Tony have been trying to discover more and more about the Makan rings, eventually leading them to the fact that they should probably explore Howard Stark's place in which he found the second Makan ring. of which has no powers active. Now obviously Jean wants to go there in order to activate the ring to gain more powers, and Tony wants to go there in order to understand more about the Makan rings, so it's a win-win to the two of them. And while Tony did plan to bring both Jean, himself, Pepper, and Rhodey, all while showing off his brand new backpack, which turns itself into his Iron Man armor, a portable Mark I if you will, but Rhodey is highly skeptical of Jean. You see, while Pepper might have had the experience previously of being kidnapped with Jean, and she has come to trust him more, Rhodey doesn't trust Jean at all, and he simply believes him to be a bad influence on Tony and the rest of the team. But Tony really just ignores this, and they go ahead anyways to break into this Stark Industries facility, which they oddly find to be completely abandoned, as Stain has absolutely zero interest in the Makan rings, or just about anything to do with history, as he cares more about finding weapons. Now, when Team Iron Man plus Jean enter the Makan temple, they find that the ring has already been taken, because Howard Stark already has it, but when traversing further inside of the area, they find the test chamber for the Makan ring, a way to activate it. Essentially, each and every one of the Makan temples is going to have a sort of test to see if you are worthy. Now, the test in this one is to say whether or not you would use knowledge or you would use the sword in order to defend in war times. Jean immediately goes to saying that it must be knowledge and it must be the book, even if Rhodey warns him that it might be dangerous and might not be correct. Jean Khan decides that he is correct, as he is definitely an arrogant prick because he believes himself to be the rightful Mandarin. Now, unfortunately, this leads to Team Iron Man and Jean being split into parties of two, with Iron Man and Pepper on one side, and Jean Khan and Rhodey left alone on the other. Now, unfortunately, Jean got it completely wrong with the book, and inadvertently ended up activating all of the stone warriors that exist as a test in the underground temple. Now, it is worth noting that both Jean and Rhodey are put together for a specific reason, and that is because right now Rhodey doesn't trust Jean at all, and it makes for good character drama. Now, of course, Pepper is in a pretty good situation being trapped with Tony, since Tony did bring his armor along with him, but in Rhodey's point of view, he's essentially screwed because obviously he doesn't know that Jean is the Mandarin. And in a bid for Jean not to expose himself as the Mandarin, Jean decides to knock Rhodey out cold and become the Mandarin in order to fight off these stone warriors, all in the event that hopefully they would all make it out alive. Now, it is very clear to Tony that they're not gonna win by just fighting these stone warriors. There are far too many of them, and his suit does have a battery life. And to complement all of that, he has to protect Pepper, so Tony has to start thinking outside of the box. So once again, Tony tries looking and reading the book to see if the book has any of the answers to stop the trial that is currently going on. But what Tony ends up finding is that the book doesn't have any of the answers. As a matter of fact, it was the sword which has the answer to stop the test on it. The whole point of this trial was to show that basically you're not going to find peace in just books, but instead you must hold your sword steady, and through having the bigger stick in the situation that you would be safer. That was what the test was for the Makan ring, and Tony was able to solve it. Now, this does end up unlocking the power of the second ring for Jean Khan to have, ultimately upping the Mandarin's power, but that is not known to either Tony nor the rest of Team Iron Man. And with the day saved and the new Makan ring in hand, Pepper did hold on to the sword, which turns out to be very smart, as the sword would reveal a map to the very next Makan ring, and this would launch what would become a more overarching story throughout the rest of this season, which is the hunt for the last 3 remaining Makan rings. Also, it is completely worth noting that Rhodey, at this point, fully trusts Jean, as Jean just saved his life. so Jean has won over the trust of the entirety of Team Iron Man.
All of us. Together. Come on, Jean.
But the next episode does cool off a little bit on the whole Makan ring thing and decides to explore a different story. To start the episode, this is the first time we will ever be introduced to AIM in this TV series, which is, of course, Advanced Idea Mechanics, or the dudes in beekeeper suits, as both EMH and this show would go on to call them. Now, I really wanted to talk about this episode mainly because it not only sets up AIM, but also sets up a brand new character transferring to the high school that Tony Stark goes to, and that would be Whitney, someone we've already met in a previous episode, but who becomes a more regular mainstay character as the show progresses forward, specifically in this first season.
Miss Stain says the two of you go way back.
If you want, I'll show her around.
And while that's going on, there is also a job fair happening at Tony's high school, and one of these stands is AIM. And AIM takes a keen interest in Tony Stark, mainly because who wouldn't? He's a complete super genius that most of the world knows about in this TV show. And AIM decides they want to give Tony a trial run on one of their brand new technologies, which is a Neuralink haptic feedback system that allow you to read somebody's mind. And so, of course, Tony in his infinite wisdom gathers up the few friends that he does have, all in order for them to be guinea pigs on this new technology. That being Happy Hogan, Rhodey, Gene Khan, Pepper, and Whitney. Now, obviously, they're all there for their own reasons. Happy Hogan because he'll get more homework done for him, because he's there on an athletic scholarship. I love Happy. Regardless, Tony decides to run this experiment on this untested technology, and as it turns out, as no surprise, it's a complete and utter trap, as this technology is just going to be a brainwashing mechanism for AIM to use in the future, and this is just their test run. So Tony then has basically all of his friends except Whitney, who didn't put on one of the inhibitors, to turn against him and start assaulting the entirety of whatever's left at the school, all in an event to get Tony Stark to become a member of AIM through one of these brain chips. Now obviously Tony and Whitney now at this point are not gonna let this happen, and so the two of them make a break for it and try to run away, and Tony specifically wants to get his backpack, which has his Iron Man suit, to which Whitney then was like, well, I want my purse.
I knew I should have brought my purse.
Are you serious? We're being chased by evil scientists and you're worried about your purse?
You wanted your backpack, and besides, it's an expensive purse.
Now, Tony does really need his backpack, and so in an event to keep Whitney safe and to be able to go play Iron Man without her noticing, he locks her in a supply closet. Now, what I do find interesting is that essentially the man who is currently controlling all of Tony's friends isn't really too far off of Tony himself if Tony were to allow himself to fall too far deep into wanting revenge on certain people. The entire reason this headset was made was so that this man could take over AIM and essentially get one over on his bosses that were making him miserable. Now obviously the distinction between those two characters is Tony has a moral compass and at least some people around him to ground him and make him normal, as opposed to the other guy who has absolutely nobody. And of course at the end of the day, Tony is able to destroy the helmet and set the dude's plans back a couple of months, potentially a year, but just know this is not the last time that AIM will be showing up in this TV show. But more importantly, at least for right now, is that this episode sets up the relationship between Tony and Whitney.
It happened yesterday. I just want to know what you're really doing here.
Truth? My father sent me here to spy on you.
And you agreed?
Yes. But not for him. I came here for my own reasons.
Now, I put such a heavy focus on Whitney because this next episode involves her heavily. So, Team Iron Man plus Jean are visiting what Stain has left of the Makan ruins, essentially all put up in a display area for his own vanity. Now, Team Iron Man plus Jean are there in order to figure out if they can find out anything more about the Makan rings just by exploring. And they honestly don't find very much. But what they do end up finding is Stain, who is shooting up his own gallery. Now, obviously, Tony and Team Iron Man are completely baffled by the fact that Stain is shooting up his own art gallery, and by the fact that Stain does pull one of these stand-in for guns at Tony's head when Tony tries to stop him. So Tony basically does what he usually does and ignores his schoolwork all in the events of trying to figure out why Stain would have a psychotic break and do something like this. All while he's also trying to find time to spend with Whitney because obviously Tony has a thing for her. He's just got a thing for blondes, I guess. And after school, Tony, in a bid to understand why Stain is destroying a bunch of his own stuff, he theorizes part of it might be for taxes, goes off to find Stain, only to figure out it's not Obadiah committing any of these crimes. As a matter of fact, it is somebody who has the ability to change into the look of whoever they are staring at. It is essentially a shapeshifter akin to someone like Mystique, except it's not Mystique, obviously. And of course, this person takes the look of Iron Man and goes on a rampage throughout the city, destroying a bunch of stuff, which leads to Tony being extremely paranoid at school that someone might figure out, and he kind of forgot that he has a secret identity. I find it pretty funny. And as the episode progresses, we find out that what the Team Iron Man named as Madame Mask is Whitney Stain. The reason all of the places being targeted are of Obadiah's owning is because Whitney is extremely upset with her father. She finds that her father has basically been taking advantage of her, has been treating her terribly, ignoring her, and as well has put far too much focus on trying to find what Tony Stark is doing and figure out Tony, as basically Whitney ended up transferring to Tony's high school all because Obadiah wanted him to be spied on by somebody he might be close to. That's kind of messed up in my opinion. So this of course leads to Whitney wanting to take revenge. So what does she do? She takes technology from the vault. As we mentioned earlier in the season, she steals the mask and decides to go on rampages, and her only goal in the beginning was to destroy all of Obadiah's stuff, to hopefully get him to stop focusing on his company and focus on her. It's really a story about a daughter and father not meeting eye to eye, and what the reality of that is when money and power are involved. And of course, at the end of the episode, Tony does eventually catch Madame Mask and find out exactly who she is, being Whitney. And of course, Whitney explains her motivation to Tony, and Tony ultimately makes a decision on his own, without consulting his team, mind you, and decides to let Whitney go, with the promise that she never dons the mask again.
Go to jail, and my father will finally notice me. I should have just turned myself in.
I'm letting you go.
What? Why?
The first time we met, you put yourself in danger to save me. So I know you're a better person than this.
And it's also worth pointing out that basically this whole episode, Team Iron Man, except for Tony, have been dunking on, but Tony, obviously knowing the background of what just happened, decides to stick up for Whitney at the end of the episode.
Maybe her dad cut her allowance down to $1 million a year. Hey, she's my friend, so ease up on her, okay? And just because she's rich doesn't mean she doesn't have any problems.
And this would begin a far closer friendship and eventually romantic relationship between Tony and Whitney, which will be important, as I keep saying, later. Now, this next episode is a little bit disjointed as it's not following a set continuous strain like the last few have, but instead trying to look at Tony Stark from an overarching view. Throughout the entirety of this first season, we have seen Tony is pretty much willing to align himself with just about anybody he believes will help him defeat Stain, and he is also very willing to use his anger as a tool in order to fight the people around him, because he believes that they deserve it. And so, every single time Tony fights a villain, he has been replicating each and every one of their technologies, all in order to use as a weapon for his own gain in order to fight future villains, to stay one step ahead of the game by using their tech. And Rhodey pushes back on this for Tony. He asks him where the line is for using technology like this and being like the villains that he fights.
Recreating these weapons to use? This technology? These people are using it to attack me. I'm gonna do whatever it takes to beat them.
And that's exactly what Tony sets out to do, to use all of the technology at his disposal to beat the villains in front of him, no matter the cost. Oh, and there's the whole subplot of, you know, school rivalry, sports rivalry, stealing each other's mascots, all that fun stuff. Pepper is, of course, running that B plot. Now, Tony once again has to deal with being Iron Man and doing Iron Man things, and dealing with a derailed train, except for the train's been derailed for months. As a matter of fact, the railway's abandoned. As it turns out, this was all a ploy for the Crimson Dynamo armor to be reintroduced as a new villain. Now, Iron Man thinks it's Ivan Vanko at first, but he soon realizes it's not Vanko. As a matter of fact, it is Stane's head of security who is sitting inside of the suit and is using it in order to capture Iron Man to hopefully get more information on his suit. Now, obviously, Rhodey isn't going to let that happen, as there is a remote shutdown function for the armor that would lock it essentially, but the problem with locking it is it also locks the user inside of the armor completely, meaning they can't move. So when Tony does eventually wake up after being knocked out O'Brien in the Crimson Dynamo suit, Tony is of course a little panicky as he quite literally cannot move. And this is where the fun part of the episode comes in, where basically Pepper runs in, shuts down all of the electricity to the building as a distraction inside of the costume that she stole from the other school, and uses this as a distraction so that Iron Man can get out of the building and back to safety. And it is worth noting that Tony is extremely upset at Anton, who he had previously saved in another episode, and is pretty much going to get his revenge on Anton in a pretty messed up way. Now, of course, Tony is completely driven by his anger, and even as Rhodey tries to be a voice of reason for him, Tony just blatantly ignores it and decides to go full balls to the walls with his revenge plan, which involves getting ready to get an armor that will be used to battle the Crimson Dynamo. Keen-eyed viewers would know this is the Hulkbuster, but in this show it's set up to be made for the Crimson Dynamo. And as well, Tony plans to upload a virus that will eat the entire computer system of Pegasus and render the entire place destroyed when it comes to having any sort of useful data.
You created a virus? Isn't that dangerous? Pegasus operates on a closed network called Delphi. There's no way the virus could spread beyond the facility.
Tony basically just wants to destroy Pegasus from the inside out, and even though there are potential risks with using this virus, he doesn't care. And Rhodey, even though he continually tries to nudge Tony on the right path and tell him what he's doing isn't exactly correct, as he's moving out of a place of revenge and less out of a place of wanting to help people like a hero should, at least in Rhodey's eyes, Tony just brushes him off and ignores him. And that's kind of frustrating for me, considering I feel we were building towards Tony moving away from this, but I think that just comes later in this first season. Now, obviously, Tony's able to destroy the Crimson Dynamo suit, upload the virus, and win the day in his mind, even if Rhodey doesn't agree with how he did it at all.
This is how we have to do it. Stay ahead of the bad guys, better armor, better weapons, better tech, whatever it takes.
And will that bring back your dad? Or fix your heart? Where does it end, Tony? How far will you go? Because I just saw your dark side. There's a line between you and the people you fight, and you're coming pretty close to crossing it, and I'm worried I won't be able to stop you.
Now, this doesn't change anything in the status quo, at least not for right now, but it is something to keep an eye on, that Tony and Rhodey aren't exactly seeing eye to eye on the decisions Tony is making right now, and that will continue into the following episodes. Oh, and of course, the virus Tony uploaded would have absolutely no ill will and or effects that may or may not be damaging or have future lasting consequences. Now on to episode 13, which is another Makan ring hunt. But if you would notice, Team Iron Man basically isn't on this hunt at all. The only people who are doing it are Tony and Jean Khan. Tony and Jean went to tackle this Makan ring completely by themselves. Now Tony's rationale for doing this is that he saw how dangerous it was at the last Makan ring site, and so he wanted to go by himself and brought Jean because he speaks Mandarin, but I don't 100% buy that. I still think there's a little bit of ill will from last episode going on here. Now, obviously, when the two of them do get inside to find these Makan rings, Jean wants to activate the trial because obviously he wants the ring active, but Tony would rather just get the ring and not deal with the trial, especially considering that the ring room is actually open for business this time. Now, when Tony does collect the ring and bring it back to Team Iron Man, they are rightfully so frustrated, specifically Rhodey, for the fact that Tony went off and did this by himself, despite asserting the fact that they were a team and that they would do these things together. Obviously, it left the two feeling left out and almost abandoned.
Pepper and I, we put ourselves out there. We try so hard to be there for you, but you shut us out every time!
Look, I get that you're mad, but you guys almost died last time we went to one of those temples. I can't risk that again.
You took Jean?
So, of course, both Rhodey and Pepper are not happy with this, but Rhodey eventually concedes and simply says that if Tony chose to do this way, he simply did. Rhodey doesn't see a whole lot of thought in arguing with it, but he does decide to take the ring and try and do some sort of research on it while they have it. But of course, since they didn't actually do the trial, the ring isn't active, so Jean willingly goes back to activate the trial in order to activate the ring because he feels as though he needs to have the ring to be usable, as Jean wants all 5 of the Makan rings to fulfill his birthright as the Mandarin. And what we end up coming to find out is this guardian of the ring is quite literally a towering mass monster that has one sole focus, and that is to get the ring back. And the person who has the ring at the moment is Rhodey. Now, even the US military tries to get involved, as obviously this is a giant creature walking the streets of New York, but nothing seems to work against this monster. Any sort of conventional weapon that gives kinetic energy simply makes the monster grow bigger and stronger. So that leaves Tony to try and have to figure out how to defeat it, and no, his repulsors didn't work at all. And to make things even worse, Jean, as the Mandarin, has come out of nowhere in order to try and obviously defeat the trial himself. And so while Iron Man and the Mandarin are having a slight little spat, Jean just decides it's not worth it and figures Iron Man can handle it himself regardless. And so now they have to figure out a way to get him to stop. Now, Rhodey presents the idea of simply handing the ring over to the being. This whole test is about courage. Rhodey's idea is what is more courageous than simply handing him the ring back. Now, what I like about this solution is that it's completely wrong. Rhodey gets it completely wrong, and I think that's something good for his character. He's not shown to be this infallible, always right goody two-shoes. He can be allowed to be wrong sometimes.
There's more than one kind of courage. What if giving back the ring is the courageous thing to do here?
Right.
What actually worked, and goes as the antithesis of what Iron Man did in the last episode, is that by giving up and by shutting down his armor, by laying down his weapons, that is the courage that the trial was looking to seek, which will then give the ring its full power and activate it. And of course, the very second the ring is activated, Jean Khan blows Iron Man out of the way and takes his hard-earned work for himself because that's just the Mandarin way. And at least at this point in the show, Iron Man is nowhere near on the power level to even try and fight the Mandarin, unfortunately, but he does at least put up a good enough fight that the Mandarin has to abandon course and leave. But if anything, this episode is another valuable lesson for Tony on the message of teamwork. He tries to do everything either on his own or maybe just with one of the multiple members of Team Iron Man. And what really needs to happen is, and when we see the team working as its best, such as in the Crimson Dynamo episode, is when they're all working together, working to their strengths. It's something Tony finally gets at the end of this episode.
We've got a better shot together. We'll find the Mandarin, and then Iron Man will take the rings back. All it takes is courage.
Thanks for ruining the moment, Pepper.
I said for now because Tony's ability to retain these kinds of lessons wavers depending on what the writers want to do with his character at that time. And as well, it's worth noting, Gene now has 3 rings and his uncle is getting a little bit antsy, being held on to as a piece of information and knowledge. So that was my look at the first half of season 1. Now for the second half of season 1, because the transition really wasn't nice, so I'm adding one here. Anyways, we established that even though it is a pretty good show, visually it's a little flawed and hasn't aged as well as I might have remembered, but the rogues gallery is amazing and some of the interpersonal drama between the characters is pretty good. So without further ado, let's go ahead and finish the rest of season 1, starting with episode 14, which doesn't have much of an overarching story for Tony nor the rest of Team Iron Man, in all honesty, but we do pick up on some new and different traits. Pepper is still fairly new to the team and is still fairly concerned about how Tony is doing in fights, whereas Rhodey is kind of just mentally checked out for 2 reasons. A, he is still pretty upset at Tony for not taking his advice throughout the previous 13 episodes, and also he's getting used to playing sideline warrior and kind of just being Tony's guy in the chair. And Tony's second battle with Whiplash didn't exactly go as expected. His armor got electrocuted and both him and Whiplash ended up out of commission. But in the process, the Iron Man armor was fairly damaged with Tony inside of it. And it seems as a result of this damage, one of Tony's new software updates he was trying to install to the armor seems to be going a little haywire, as the armor itself has started scanning for Whiplash and any other threats that may be to Tony Stark, all looking for a fight, basically. And once again, in another confrontation with Whiplash, Tony manages to get his armor electrocuted during a thunderstorm, which starts to cause the armor to bug out even more than it was the first time. And when Tony does get back from high school the following day, he tries to check up on the armor and see what is wrong, but the armor itself seems to be acting strange, doing things for Tony as well as seemingly being overprotective of him, as we see the armor even shocks Rhodey when he suggests disassembling it and looking to see if anything is wrong with it. But during the process of all of this, Tony does get another alert that Fix-It and Whiplash are back on the radar, and that the 2 of them need to be dealt with by his armor. And so, despite Rhodey's protest, Tony decides to go out and confront them, only for the Iron Man armor to take full control of his body. Tony literally had no control over himself in this confrontation with Whiplash and with Mr. Fix-It. And because of this lack of control, the armor almost neutralizes one of Tony's villains, something Tony is very apt against in this series is killing, most likely because he's a teenager and it's a kid's show. But this seems to really rattle Tony to his core that this happened.
There was nothing I could do. The way it tore into them, it was like it had a mind of its own.
All the tech you put in, maybe something went wrong in that first fight with Whiplash. Ever since then, it's been...
Well, Tony finally relents to let Rhodey tear it down and maybe get a look at it. He receives several distressed texts from Pepper Potts, and so Tony leaves to go check on Pepper, only to find out Pepper didn't send him a single text. It was, in fact, his armor that was sending those text messages. Also that his armor could take out Rhodey to prevent from being disassembled. You see, during the fights with Whiplash and during the fights with Mr. Fix-It, the armor has developed its own sort of AI programming. It does have a few rules within itself, such as protecting the user above all costs, and so the armor believes that it can protect Anthony Edward Stark the best by keeping him inside the armor permanently. as at the end of the day, the armor just wants to protect Tony, even if it is against his wishes. And when Rhodey does try to intervene and protect Tony, Tony decides to take the hit instead, fearing that Rhodey might end up injured. But at the end of the day, the armor does do its #1 protocol, which is saving and protecting the user, and so the Iron Man armor does give its own life, in a theoretical sense, in order to save Tony and jumpstart his heart after nearly killing him. At the end of the day, despite all of the problems and issues the armor was giving him, it did once again save Tony's life, as it has done since the very first episode of this show, in which it saved his life from what would have killed him in that plane crash where his father was taken from him. But funnily enough, and for the most part, this episode is kind of more like an episodic adventure in this show, and doesn't have too many lasting ramifications on Team Iron Man or Iron Man in general, but I still enjoyed this episode. Also gives us a tease that's never followed up on again. Now, the next episode I find to be far more important, which is an episode about mutual loss. The episode opens with a pretty funny sequence in which Pepper is basically lying and telling Rhodey that she got information from her father about what would be stolen vibranium and a new threat coming to New York, and she completely lies about how she gets that information, which is kind of funny. This episode is highly important for a few reasons. Firstly, it starts to open the more broad Marvel universe to this TV show. And throughout this show, we'll get actually a lot of cameos from different Marvel universe characters. And I think it's great that they really started doing this with Black Panther, one of my personal favorite Marvel heroes. Now, at this point in Black Panther's arc, he is very much by himself and alone. He believes in the traditional values of Wakanda, and that means not receiving any sort of help from any outsiders, especially Iron Man, who he has read about. Now, what I think this episode does a really great job of is developing a parallel between T'Challa and Iron Man throughout this episode. We see the two characters truly aren't that much far off from each other, both being fairly young men who have recently lost their fathers and are trying to do right by their people. Tony's happen to be Stark Tower and Stark Industries, whereas T'Challa's is Wakanda. And in the process though, T'Challa is very much standoffish. He does have those traditional Wakandan values. He believes in doing it by himself, and that taking outsider help will make him weak. And unfortunately for T'Challa, he has to take this outsider help, as AIM has developed technology that can actually affect T'Challa's vibranium armor by using its ability to store kinetic energy against himself. And so Tony has to go out of his way to save T'Challa, in which Tony actually manages to figure out who he is. And T'Challa is less than grateful that his life was saved by Iron Man. As a matter of fact, T'Challa wants absolutely nothing to do with anyone there and threatens Tony's life, per usual.
And I care less about you! Outsiders have brought only trouble and pain to Wakanda. I will catch Moses Magnum, and Iron Man will not stand in my way!
But honestly, this kind of parallels Tony. It wasn't too long ago that he believed just by himself, and with a little help from Rhodey, that he could take on all of Stain and regain Stark Enterprises. Both Tony and T'Challa share that same sort of rage and almost single-minded nature, although Tony is far more open to working with other people. Now, obviously, Tony was not just going to allow T'Challa to do whatever he wanted, especially not in his city, so Iron Man resolves to go and help T'Challa to hopefully make sure that he doesn't die. And it's a pretty good thing Iron Man showed up, because once again, AIM had T'Challa dead to rights, and now they've pretty much supercharged T'Challa's vibranium suit, and if he does not release some of this energy, he will quite literally explode. Now obviously, T'Challa is going to release that energy by doing what he does best, and that's kicking some bad guys into next week. And when it's all finally said and done, T'Challa not only gets his revenge on Magnus, who had stolen from his people and was selling vibranium as a weapon to other countries, but unfortunately, for a moment, he believes that the vibranium is nowhere to be found and that Magnus might have sold it. And for the first time in this episode, we get to truly see T'Challa having doubts as he tries to reconcile with the fact that he failed his people. And this really does hurt T'Challa deep down, as he cares for his people more than anything. He cares about being the Black Panther, about protecting them. But thankfully, Iron Man's got his back.
Look, I know what you're going through.
You know nothing.
I know what it means to lose a father, to have to take on his responsibilities. Trust me, I know. But I also know that I couldn't have done it without friends. You don't have to go through this alone, T'Challa.
I am not a child any longer. I am a king, and a king cannot ask for help.
You didn't ask for my help. You were just in my way.
This episode held a mirror not only for Tony up to himself, but for T'Challa up to himself as well, as the two characters finally find common ground and are able to reconcile with each other, as Black Panther finally figures out that maybe, just maybe, there is something good to getting help from outsiders. And it takes teaming up with Iron Man to come to this conclusion. But overall, I really enjoyed this episode too. I thought it was pretty awesome. It's one of my favorites of this season, just because I love Black Panther. Regardless, the next episode is a return of one of my personal favorite characters in this show, the Living Laser. Now, Living Laser has actually had it pretty rough since his first run-in with Tony. He has essentially been living as nothing but pure energy for however long it's been since that episode. There's no clear timeline in the show. But regardless, if you know anything about human nature, being left alone by yourself for that long will cause something called psychosis. And I think that's what he is very much exhibiting. He is constantly hearing that he is a failure from everybody who has made his life miserable, whether that was his mother, the leader of his Magia sect, or Iron Man specifically. And so he latches onto this hate in order to materialize himself once again, this time on a SHIELD space carrier, which has the ability to amplify his powers, essentially using him as a magnifying glass to strike down orbital lasers that can hit anywhere on the planet. And so the Living Laser does this all just to get the attention of Iron Man. He does all of this simply to get Tony's attention and to get Tony to show up to the space station in order to confront him. And the Living Laser struck an uninhabited part of Earth for now, absolutely demolishing it, and threatens to do the same thing to New York and to the rest of the world if Iron Man does not go and approach him, so that the Living Laser can prove that he is not a loser. Now, obviously, Tony isn't gonna let this slide, and we get to see another one of Tony's best armors, in my opinion, in the show, that being the deep space suit, which has a really clean black and gold aesthetic, which is personally one of my favorites. And of course, this episode is also important for introducing us to Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D., the larger organization behind a lot of the protection of the Marvel Universe in this show. And Nick Fury basically does not believe in Iron Man at all. He believes Iron Man is nothing more than a loose cannon who will do more harm than good, because he is not a part of the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization. It's also worth noting this is Nick Fury Jr., once again, as he is pretty much going to become the base Nick Fury for all shows and movies going forward. Regardless, Nick Fury has his own plan of trying to get to the Living Laser, and basically tells Iron Man to stay out of it and that this is official S.H.I.E.L.D. business. But of course, Iron Man doesn't listen and goes to the space station instead, of which Nick Fury gives him an ultimatum. Iron Man has about 2-ish hours to save the people on the station, the only 2 S.H.I.E.L.D. agents left, and to stop the Living Laser before he absolutely nukes the station and kills everybody inside. But of course, when Tony does get into the station, he makes the crucial mistake of trying to once again insult the Living Laser while trying to save the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents that are there.
You just want to take me out? Then what? Surely you can't be so petty to put millions of lives at risk just for revenge.
Watch me. The Magia, my mother, they called me useless, worthless. But now the whole world's gonna know that I'm calling the shots. Destroying New York, that'll send a message. But hurting you, that's personal.
This entire ordeal is quite literally just for the Living Laser to try and hurt Tony and to get back at him for being called a loser. Living Laser's pretty much gone fully insane by this point, as he hallucinates hearing Tony Stark, he hallucinates hearing, Iron Man. He also hallucinates hearing his mother just continually dog on him, and although he is an unreliable narrator, if what his mother said is true, this dude had a pretty terrible mother, but obviously that doesn't excuse his life choices, nor the way in which he is trying to take revenge on Iron Man throughout this episode. Now, Tony plans to seal Living Laser within the telescope that he has been using to threaten the world with the help of both S.H.I.E.L.D. agents that are currently in the vicinity of him that he's trying to save. And while he's doing this, he's got all of about 5 to 6 minutes before Nick Fury absolutely blows up the entire station, and Fury definitely wasn't bluffing. Now, Tony's plan is successful, and he is able to successfully capture the Living Laser and save the station, but his relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D. is extremely strained at this point. Nick Fury views him as a loose cannon, and Iron Man views S.H.I.E.L.D. as a cold, heartless organization that just doesn't care for its own people. And also, Tony's a little frustrated because Nick Fury didn't give him an good job for saving the day, because Tony needs that little bit of ego stroking as per usual.
Here's a piece of advice. Quit while you're ahead. You've had your fun, now leave it to the pros. Right now, you're a loose cannon in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s eyes. You just better make sure you keep doing more good than harm, because the minute you mess up, we take you down. For good.
And that pretty much wraps up the episode. Tony nearly gets himself killed in space, saving the world from the Living Laser threat, and we meet S.H.I.E.L.D. along with Nick Fury, which is another part of the show that I love so much, is its willingness to expand to the broader Marvel universe and bring in so many more characters than other TV shows would. And I think that's a benefit of a lot of the early 2000s Marvel shows. Now, obviously, on to the next episode, in which we get an appearance from everybody's favorite Black Cat ripoff, Madame Mask. That was a joke, please don't flame me for that. Now, the last time we left off with Madame Mask, she had promised to never use the mask again. It was revealed that it was Whitney Stane, and that she was doing it to get back at her father, Obadiah. Now, of course, we see her taking the face of Tony Stark and going to a party and shooting up the entire place. All this while the real Tony Stark is sitting at home and absolutely freaking out with Rhodey about being caught for shooting up a place that he clearly wasn't at. Meanwhile, the police come to Tony's house to arrest him and to take his official statement, along with interrogations. But thankfully, Roberta, who is Rhodey's mom, who I didn't really talk much about in the first episode, is a lawyer, and so she will be Tony's lawyer for this sort of semi-legal issue throughout this episode that they kind of just brush under the rug. Tony is extremely frustrated with Whitney at this point. She had promised to never use the Madame Mask again, and to basically never do something like this again, but now not only is she doing it, but using Tony's face for it. But oddly enough, Whitney actually has a very good explanation as to why she's doing it.
I overheard him on the phone talking about it. A contract had been put out on Tony. He said it was happening soon. I never thought he would do something like that. But I know that when Tony turns 18, he'll take the company away from my dad. I didn't want to believe it, but I started following Tony as Madame Mask, and that's when I saw him.
As it turns out, there's been a hit placed on Tony Stark by what Whitney believes to be her father, Obadiah Stane, and it is shown that this hit is by somebody called the Ghost, a man who is absolutely broken and also one of the coolest Iron Man villains. He has invisibility, he has the ability to go completely intangible, and he's got tech that's nearly on par with Tony Stark. Now, of course, just like anybody, Tony is extremely paranoid. He is scared because the Ghosts can get him at any time, anywhere. And of course, that makes Tony extremely afraid. He doesn't want to go to school and he doesn't want to do anything. But it's oddly enough Roberta who acts as Tony's mother figure throughout this entire show, who comes in and gives Tony a pep talk in order to make sure that he's just kind of living his life instead of just being held up inside of his room. But that doesn't stop Tony's anxiety from pretty much going crazy and causing him to act erratically. Oh, and did I forget to mention that he just pretty much hasn't spoken to any of his friends almost at all throughout this entire process. And of course, Tony is a little bit frustrated still at Whitney for impersonating him and trying to get him arrested so he doesn't get killed by the Ghost, but that is kind of whatever. Tony's pretty much isolating himself from any sort of support that he has had throughout this show, but this is not too far out of character for him. It is something that he would do. And of course, we get an encounter between Tony and Ghost pretty much trounces on Tony badly, as Tony has no way of seeing him nor touching him. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But this ends up leading to one of the more cool sequences in the show, and that's a team up between Madam Mask and Iron Man, as the two team up in order to go find the Ghost. Now obviously, Rhodey and Pepper see this team up and are very, very confused and very, very frustrated, as Tony had never told them that Whitney was Madam Mask and that he had let her go. And this action is coming back to bite him several episodes later, as it fractures the trust that the Team Iron Man had within the group, especially the trust that Pepper had in Tony. Because he keeps just leaving them out of major decisions, they feel as though Tony doesn't trust them enough.
I'm done. I'm done with you keeping us out. We're there for you, by your side, taking the same risks as you, and you leave us hanging every time!
Just listen, please. She thinks her dad hired an assassin named the Ghost to take me out. I didn't even know until last night, but Whitney's been helping. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you.
Now, no matter how much Tony wanted to apologize or how bad he felt for keeping them out, Pepper is pretty fed up at this point, to the point that she just leaves. For the rest of this episode, we don't see Pepper because she feels genuinely betrayed by Tony. First, he lied to her about being Iron Man, then he continues to lie to her constantly, keeping her in the dark. But Rhodey, on the other hand, decides to stay, because he's just that guy. We stan Rhodey for real. But Rhodey comes up with the idea of using the Madam Mask mask as a way to trick the Ghost into believing Tony Stark has showed up, as Ghost has captured Whitney. Now, at this point, the plan did not go as planned, as Iron Man and the Ghost are fairly evenly matched, even if saying the Ghost might just be a better combatant at this point in the show. Now, Rhodey is currently pretending to be Tony and is currently out of commission, but Whitney is actually the person who saves the day with her quick thinking. He is a contract killer, that is what Ghost does. So what better way to beat a contract killer than just wiring him double what the original contract was? And since Whitney is stupid rich, she can just do that. And then it just works, and Ghost decides to go do whatever he's gonna do with those millions of dollars that he just got for not even having to kill anybody. And this marks one of the few and first times Tony actually goes out of his way to ask for help from one of his friends, and Rhodey truly appreciates that.
Thanks for actually trusting me enough to ask for help.
I don't know if Pepper's ever gonna forgive me. Do you think she's gonna turn Whitney in?
I don't know. Do you think
Pepper, despite her reservations and true belief in the justice system, decided not to turn Whitney in and decided to come back to the team, mainly because these are her friends and because she believes in Tony and she believes in Team Iron Man. For all intents and purposes, Pepper is the heart of Team Iron Man, the bubbly, energetic, and sometimes insane heart of the team, but it doesn't fully function without her, and so I'm glad she didn't get away for too long. But that leads us into our next episode, which, as you can see from the graphic, isn't exactly the most focused on Tony Stark. This episode, I believe, is more Jean-centric. It is more of a Jean Con episode than anything else. You see, Jean has a stepfather who is actually in charge of the 10 Rings and is supposed to be Mandarin, but that is technically Jean's birthright, not his stepfather's, and so Jean has his stepfather locked in a prison where nobody can find him while Jean masquerades around as the Mandarin as his stepfather. And this episode serves to show that the 10 Rings are starting to get slightly suspicious of the Mandarin's acts. Oh, and also this episode starts by giving us a pretty funny sequence in which we see the tensions between Jean, Rhodey, and Pepper Potts boil over, along with Happy Hogan and Whitney, and this is all stemming from the fact that Tony is now dating Whitney Stain and not Pepper. And Pepper is not happy with that at all. Now, this little scuffle leads to each one of them all getting in trouble and having to do an extra credit assignment in pairs. And as it turns out, Pepper ends up paired with Jean Con. And this ends up with Pepper genuinely trying to form a connection with Jean despite how hard she's been on him throughout the majority of this show.
I don't care about the paper.
What?
I know that you and Tony are friends, and that I've been really rude to you. I've said some mean things, and, I'm sorry.
And so Jean and Pepper forego their assignment and spend time together genuinely getting to know each other. Reminds me of those Adventures with Zuko episodes in Avatar. Loved those as a kid. Regardless, Jean and Pepper end up spending a majority of this episode together, and in the process, Jean is actually supposed to be making a deal with the Magia as the Mandarin. And of course, Pepper, being the nosy friend that she is, decides to tag along and ends up getting caught in the crossfire between these two rival gang organizations meeting. Now, it is important as well to establish in this episode that Black Knight is introduced as a villain for Iron Man, so is the head of the Magia. Now, this episode really stems around Jean trying to figure out how to not only save Pepper, but also save Face as the Mandarin, and at the end of the day, he has to pick between being the Mandarin or being Jean Khan in this situation. And I think this is important for his character, especially going throughout, not just season 1, but season 2. Jean decides to be himself instead of the Mandarin in order to save Pepper. Jean decides to forego taking out his biggest rival gang inside of the city, all to save Pepper. Jean chooses to be Jean and not to be the Mandarin. And I think that's highly important for later. Now, obviously, Pepper gains a certain bit of respect for Jean and a certain bit of care for him. And so we see those two become more of friends and less frenemies as the show prolongs and goes on. But all isn't fine and dandy. The Ten Rings take a big notice of the fact that the Mandarin was absent from this meeting when they needed him most, and they also take a big note that he has been acting extremely different over the last few months.
Because this man that we followed the last few months, this man is not the Mandarin.
And with the Jean-centric episode over, today we're going to focus on Tony Stark's actions really coming back to bite him. Remember back a few episodes ago when Tony decided to create the virus Technovore, and how I said that it might become a problem later? Yeah, Technovore is a big problem. The system it uses has essentially not stopped eating any of the data that Pegasus, the company, was working on. As a matter of fact, it spread to nanomachines, now has a physical body, and is going around eating everything in sight. And if that doesn't make things worse enough, S.H.I.E.L.D. is now knocking down the door of Tony Stark. Obviously, Tony's paranoid that they might have figured out he's Iron Man. Meanwhile, Pepper is just super stoked.
So S.H.I.E.L.D. jail. On the helicarrier. It'd be like our own private tour that never ended.
Yeah, that's great, Pepper. Maybe we could share a cell with the living laser.
Now, obviously, S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't actually there because they know Tony is Iron Man. As a matter of fact, S.H.I.E.L.D. is there because they need help with one of their engine turbines that nobody in the world knew how to fix except for Howard Stark. And their hope is that Tony will know how to fix their engines. Now, Tony could only bring one person along with him, and he chose to bring Pepper because Rhodey wanted to stay back and hold down the fort. And in the process, Rhodey learns about Technovore and the fact that it is ripping Pegasus apart as of current. Now, Tony is obviously enjoying his time at S.H.I.E.L.D. and thinks it's really cool. So Rhodey, being the good friend he is, doesn't want to ruin that for Tony and decides that he can handle the Technovore problem on his own, which isn't very smart, like, at all. But it is the first episode we see Rhodey use any sort of Iron Man type technology. Now, when Rhodey does show up, it's bad. Technovore has pretty much implied that it's killed every person there, and that it's pretty much eaten through a majority of the technology in that facility as well, and it's just scary to look at. And now with it being exposed to new technology, Rhodey is in a lot of trouble. But flipping back to Tony for a second, who already has a pretty negative view of S.H.I.E.L.D. from his interactions with them as Iron Man, he ends up finding out how they're keeping the living laser contained at S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, and it is inhumane to say the least. As a matter of fact, the living laser is quite literally dying, and S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't really seem to care, which doesn't sit well with Tony at all. leading to Tony asking the question of why his father would even work with a company like this at all.
He's a bad guy, kid. You may remember the time he tried to destroy New York.
So this is what he gets, is that it? That's how S.H.I.E.L.D. operates? I'm surprised my dad agreed to make these engines for you.
I'm not. He'd already made the carrier's weapon systems.
That's right, Tony finally gets the big reveal that his father made weapons, specifically weapons for S.H.I.E.L.D. and other military organizations. Now, this comes to Tony as a gigantic shock, as for the 16 years Tony knew his father, he preached nothing but protecting the world and keeping it safe, and keeping weapons out of being what's made, to rather protect people than do something like that. Oh, and Rhodey finally wisens up, gets smart, and asks Tony for help. Now, do I think Rhodey is incapable? No, but he does not have an Iron Man suit, so he really shouldn't have done this by himself. Now, obviously, Tony comes in to try and save the day, but Technovore essentially just will absorb Iron Man's suit, and there is almost no way to stop it through conventional means, which obviously frustrates Tony. And so Tony does something very interesting and something pretty big, a lesson that he learned a few episodes earlier, if you remember, with the gigantic Makan ring challenge, which is that the weapons can't win in this scenario. It has to be his brains. And so Tony decides to give Technovore exactly what it wants, the Iron Man suit. But he simply sets the suit to obliterate itself, explode, in the hopes that it would get rid of Technovore and get rid of all of their problems. Now, obviously, this works. Tony succeeds in this, but he still has to deal with the realization that not only is the living laser being treated like absolute trash and basically dying, but also that his father, a man who preached being good in protecting the world, had sold weapons in the past. And that really hits Tony hard, and it's just something you should keep in the back of your mind going forward with the rest of this episode, as it won't be directly important within the next 10 minutes, but maybe further on in the video, depending on how far the next episode is from now. Whatever. Regardless, it's time for another adventure with Gene Khan. That's right, Gene gets another episode that is far more centered on him than anything else. In this episode, we actually get to see Gene's backstory. We get to meet his mother. We get to understand why he is so passionate about being the Mandarin and acquiring all the rings. It is his birthright, and that's something his mother had promised him as far as when he was a child. Now, flashing forward to present day, Team Iron Man plus Gene are looking for the next Makan ring. And obviously, they all want to get the next Makan ring, mainly because Tony wants to study it and keep it out of the hands of the Mandarin, and Gene because this is his birthright and he is the Mandarin. Now, Tony has been analyzing The Last Guardian for the last few weeks and has the exact whereabouts of the next Makan ring. But there is a debate within Team Iron Man, and that's whether or not to let Gene in on the fact that Tony is Iron Man.
Pepper, are you nuts? I mean, I know you're all into Gene now, but seriously.
Seriously what? What does he need to do to make you trust him? He saved my life. He saved your life. Gene's risked his neck to help us.
Yeah, man, it really was like a trip with Zuko for real. Regardless, Pepper really does believe in bringing Gene into the fold, but Tony and Rhodey aren't quite on that same level yet. And taking another flashback, we get to see how exactly Gene's stepfather came into the picture, and why exactly Gene's stepfather is currently the Mandarin and in control of the 10 rings. We get to see his stepfather, who, mind you, has not aged in the last 10 years, so that man's skincare routine must have either been horrible when he was younger, or has been really good, because that Mandarin juice must be keeping him alive. Regardless, we see that Gene's birthright was taken from him to be quote-unquote safeguarded, but that simply wasn't true. Now, Team Iron Man did finally make their way to getting the next Makan ring without Gene. They made the executive decision to go without him, and that wasn't exactly the smartest decision, even if they didn't know that he was the Mandarin to begin with, because each one of these rings has a trial, and this trial would prove to be particularly annoying. Essentially, they need to find a balance between the blue coals and the red coals inside of a big cylinder. Now, Pepper decides that blue on blue is the best option, and she just throws 2 blue crystals in, and this ends up unleashing the challenge, which happens to be Rhodey being turned into a sort of lava monster that can straight up rival the Iron Man armor in hand-to-hand combat with almost 0 issues. As a matter of fact, it often is overpowering the Iron Man armor. Now, while all of that is going on, Pepper makes the decision to try and call Jean in the event of getting his help, hoping that Jean would be able to help her with figuring out the solution to this problem while Tony tries to fight Rhodey. Oh, did I mention that all of this is also happening inside of an active volcano? Yes, an active volcano, just to make everything just slightly better. Under the advice of Jean, Pepper decides to take the red coals and put them inside of the big laser at the center, hoping that this would reverse the effects of the blue ones and get rid of whatever lava monster has encapsulated Rhodey. But instead, it does get rid of the lava monster and Rhodey, but instead transfers it to Pepper, which ends up causing the exact same problem no matter what. The entire test is based around balance, and by just adding one instead of both at the same time, you create an imbalance, which obviously leads to the lava monsters. But getting back to Jean flashbacks for a little bit, it is revealed that Jean's mother died, and I believe personally that it's implied that his stepfather killed Jean's mother, all for the reason of taking the Makan ring that she had, but we're not 100% sure on that, because again, it is a kid's show and they can't do things like confirm that one person killed another without some sort of repercussions from the network. But now it's time for Rhodey to get on call with Jean and try and figure out a way to stop this test. And so the two of them come up with an idea, and that's to use both at the same time. Now obviously, since Rhodey is the only one there, he has to try and push them both in at the same time and just hope the crystals land. And this actually is the correct answer to the test. Now, they are still in an active volcano that is falling apart, so Tony has to quickly get the Makan ring and get his friends and get out of there. And he does so successfully, being the only Makan ring that is actually in possession of Team Iron Man and Tony Stark. So actually rare W from Team Iron Man against the Mandarin, who is one of their best friends, which I find hilarious. I think this was a really good episode for explaining the motivations behind what Jean does. It helps to paint him in a more sympathetic villain light, or more as an antagonist and less as a villain, at least throughout this first season. Now it's time for our third and final appearance of the Living Goat, the Living Laser. So, Living Laser at this point is dying. The suit he used to give himself his powers was unfinished and has left Living Laser completely unstable. He is going to turn into nothing but pure energy coming up soon, and there's nothing that S.H.I.E.L.D. believes they can do to help him. But you know who does decide to help him? Tony Stark. Tony goes out of his way to try and help save the Living Laser's life.
My dad's technology is causing it.
So your dad, he was some kind of crazy inventor?
You could say that. So this is his mess, and now it's my responsibility.
This isn't your dad's fault, kid. It's Iron Man's.
What?
Now, despite Tony trying to take responsibility for the faults of his father once again, as Tony is holding an extreme grudge against his dad because he feels lied to, that his dad worked on weapons for years and not only didn't tell Tony, but preached to Tony throughout his entire life that weapons were evil and that they shouldn't make them. Now, Living Laser still blames Iron Man because he's a bit delusional and a bit crazy, and he's a bit too self-centered at this point to realize that a lot of this really does fall back on him and it is his fault. But Tony wants to right the wrongs of the past, and so he is trying to help Living Laser. That is until Ghost shows up, and this time he's not coming for Tony. No, he's coming for the Living Laser. I cannot believe I just said that sentence. Don't clip that, please. Regardless, Ghost is trying to capture the Living Laser, all for AIM. Advanced Idea Mechanics is back once again as another antagonist, and they want the Living Laser as a sort of living battery for them. The whole idea behind getting the Living Laser and bringing him to AIM is because it's the controller's last-ditch effort to prove that all of his time with technology is not a waste. This is Controller's magnum opus. It is MODOK. I'm not going to explain out his acronym because I don't remember it. Regardless, MODOK is essentially not alive yet, and the living laser's energy would power MODOK and bring him to life, all at the cost of the living laser's life. Now, living laser at this point is already dying, but he doesn't want to die even more painfully, powering a machine that is going to be used for death and destruction by AIM. Flipping back to Tony for a little bit, he is erratic and is trying to get back home as soon as possible so he can go deal with the living laser situation. But Roberta isn't having any of it. She is his motherly figure throughout this show, and she knows when something is off and something is wrong. And she wants to confront Tony about it to give him the chance to tell her what's wrong. And so Tony simply explains that he'd been out so late because he's working on a project of his father's, and then leaves it vague. He essentially does not want to have a conversation with his mother, nor does he even want to have a conversation with Rhodey about how he's feeling. Instead, he wants to right the wrongs of his father, the perceived wrongs of his dad, and Tony does so in a very angry and angsty teenage way, as no surprise to anybody who's watched my last episode or just seen this show in general. Now, Tony tries to once again go and save the living laser from AIM as they're trying to use him to resurrect MODOK and create life, essentially. And they order Ghost to fight Iron Man, and Ghost is just kind of like, y'all ain't paying me enough for this. I already did my job. Unless you got more money, I'm leaving. So this leaves Iron Man essentially trying to go one-on-one with all of AIM, and he's about to go one-on-one with the newly alive MODOK, which doesn't end very well for him, like, at all. As MODOK is extremely powerful and has abilities Iron Man just is not prepped for yet. And surprisingly, Living Laser isn't quite dead just yet from being essentially stripped of the only pieces of energy that was keeping him alive in this moment. But in the moments of Iron Man basically being dominated by MODOK, Living Laser comes to a realization that the only person who has actually tried to care for him in his entire life is Tony Stark, and he comes to the realization that potentially Tony Stark is Iron Man, and that perhaps Iron Man has actually had Living Laser's best interests at heart throughout the entire show.
That can't be. Tony? Tony can't be Iron Man. Tony tried to help me. Tony tried to save my life, not Iron Man.
And so Living Laser decides to do the first good thing he's chosen to do throughout this entire series in this episode. As he is nearly dying, he decides to try and stop MODOK and to save Iron Man, the only person who has actually ever cared for him or shown him any sort of kindness. We get a really cool sequence of Living Laser draining MODOK before it's all said and done for him, honestly, as Living Laser is quite literally on his deathbed. And it is somber, but it is incredibly sweet.
My life, I was a nobody. Then I get this power and I use it to try and hurt you. The one guy who wanted to help me.
But you saved me, Arthur.
Yeah, imagine that. I'm the guy who saved Iron Man.
And with that, the Living Laser is gone for good this time, right? Yeah, no way he comes back, right? Anyways, with that being over, S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up and obviously wants to detain everything and anything having to do with Living Laser and AIM. But we also need to tie up the fact that Tony is still feeling miserable about the fact that his dad made weapons. And it is in this that Roberta reveals that the day Howard Stark stopped making weapons was the day Tony Stark was born. The day Tony was born is the day Howard decided that making weapons was no longer his company's purpose nor his life purpose, and that it would be more important to build a good, clean world for his son to live in, one that his son could be proud of, a company his son could lead one day. And that rejuvenates Tony's spirits, and also just ends the episode on a really happy note. Now, this next episode, I came up with the name Happy Detour because I'm not going to talk about it very much. It is almost completely unimportant to anything character-wise throughout this show, and I'm only including it for a few reasons. Reason number one is that this is the first time we are ever going to see Rhodey don any sort of Iron Man armor or armor in general in a full capacity and actually go out and use it. Rhodey literally crashes the suit in the middle of New York, where we're going to meet up with the rest of the cast, that being Whitney, Pepper, Happy Hogan, and Gene Khan, who Gene and Pepper were together in a car hanging out when Whitney and Happy were invited along just to spite the other two of them. It's pretty hilarious. But Happy gets his hands on an Iron Man suit, gets in the suit, and decides that this is his time to shine and be a hero, as he believes Iron Man is a robot. Yeah, this episode is nothing short of pure comedy, and I absolutely love it, and that's just why I want to talk about it. It's really the only episode that's going to get this short treatment. And to make this episode even funnier, Happy has to save the entirety of New York from Killer Shrike and Unicorn, who are about to accidentally blow it up trying to rob a bank. Oh, that, and we see interventions by both Madam Mask, and we see an intervention by the Mandarin as well, and that just kind of makes this episode pretty hilarious. It doesn't have a lot of substance, it doesn't have a lot of character, but it might just be my favorite episode of the season, simply because I love Happy, and it's a Happy Hogan-centric episode. On to the next episode, and wait, what is this? Is it another thing featuring the Hulk that I get to talk about? No chance. That's right, you all get to listen to me glaze the Hulk for another, give or take 5 to 8 minutes. Regardless, this episode is completely centered around two things. One, Pepper's absolute hatred for Team Iron Man and the responsibilities that are coming with it. The lying, the sneaking around, the missing class, and just the general having her life in danger constantly. She's just kind of not with it, even though she doesn't want to leave the team. It is frustrating. And this episode also centers around the fact of introducing another Marvel character into the universe, that being Hulk, one of my personal favorites. Now, Hulk is basically rampaging throughout New York, attacking AIM, who is after him, and so of course Tony can't have this be happening, as the only thing Tony knows about the Hulk is that he is a raging monster that the United States government is afraid of. And so Iron Man busts out what has not been officially named the Hulkbuster, but I'm going to call it the Hulkbuster, even though he had it multiple episodes before Hulk even showed up. And this fight does not go very well for Iron Man. He pretty much loses because what's gonna beat the Hulk? What I really love about this episode, though, is that it includes Rick Jones, one of Hulk's prominent side characters in his older comics that we almost never see in this modern era of Hulk. And as it turns out, Rick is currently being mind controlled by the Controller, who, if you remember from last episode, was recently kicked out of AIM. Now, the Controller is currently in control of Rick, all for the hope that he can get control of the Hulk, and when that doesn't work, he goes for Plan B, which is controlling Iron Man, or Tony Stark. Now, we find out the reason that Hulk has been rampaging against AIM is that both Hulk and Rick James are on the run together. The two characters are practically inseparable and are extremely close, and since Rick James is being controlled by AIM, Hulk is absolutely losing it trying to fight AIM while also getting Rick James back to hopefully make him safe. Now, Rick is shown to be what Betty typically is in her role for Hulk, which is the force that keeps him calm and keeps him grounded to reality. And I've never personally been the biggest fan of that Hulk trope, as I figure Hulk is pretty smart on his own, but it is kind of cool that we are getting a far more classic variant of Hulk with a bit less nuance, as we are typically given a more smart Hulk more often than not nowadays. Now, Controller is obviously reveling in the fact that he has full control of Iron Man and his Hulkbuster armor, which is Tony's most destructive armor yet, and most powerful armor. And this episode kind of devolves into an all-out war between the Controller controlling what is Tony Stark, AIM in control of, well, themselves, and unfortunately still in the possession of MODOK, who, yes, is still alive despite living Laser's sacrifice. And what we're gonna see is Team Iron Man with Hulk. So all three of these factions are fighting in what is a fairly decent combat sequence for this show. They don't really excel that much at the combat sequences, unfortunately. Now, Hulk is fairly easily able to take down Iron Man in his Hulkbuster armor after Iron Man deals with MODOK, while still being under the control of the controller, and it's probably the last time we'll see the controller for this specific season. But in the end, everything works out as Rick Jones is able to tell Hulk that Iron Man is saved, and that the real threat is the controller, and Tony is pretty much able to arrest the controller, with Iron Man finding a friend in Hulk, and with Hulk actually finding a friend in Pepper Potts, and Pepper realizing that Team Iron Man, at the end of the day, ain't so bad after all.
Hulk like Pepper. Pepper funny.
Alright, next episode. I hope you're not sick of Madame Mask yet, because we have, once again, another episode centered around her. Now, you see, Madame Mask, or Whitney, has been having severe hallucinations recently. Those majority of them being of her dad, basically berating her for being terrible. Now, Whitney is having these hallucinations and is getting extremely sick. And so she decides to put on the mask once again in an attempt to confront her father and basically kill him, because she is going insane by seeing him everywhere, constantly threatening her and Tony, who she loves very deeply. Now, she ends up getting caught because she is sick and sloppy, only for Obadiah to realize that Madame Mask is her daughter using a stolen piece of technology from the Stark Vault. But he also realizes that his daughter is extremely sick. Now, Obadiah Stane is a lot of things. He's a terrible person, he's a terrible businessman, and just overall is terrible. Like, he's just bad. I wish I could say some stronger words, but YouTube does YouTube things. Regardless, Obadiah does at least have one thing going for him, and that's the fact that he cares about his daughter a lot. He actually loves his daughter, even if he barely shows it or just doesn't outright show it at all. And so he actually comes to Tony Stark hoping for his help in saving Whitney. And of course, Tony agrees because he loves Whitney. He cares about her a lot.
Oh, nuts.
When did you...
This is what is causing my daughter's sickness. Your father invented it, and no one can understand what it is. Tony, I need your help.
Now, Tony, because he's a legitimate genius, is able to pretty easily and quickly determine what her illness is and how exactly to fix it, but basically warns against using the Madame Mask again or any time in the future, as it may cause genuine permanent brain damage, i.e. that in memory, basically from when she started using the mask to the current moment in time she would lose her memory. Now, Tony needs one singular thing in order to make this cure, and it happens to be in the Arctic, and we are once again going to get introduced to a gimmick suit that I love so much that barely shows up after its first appearance, that being the Arctic suit, which is just so awesome. It's basically using technology Tony had originally used his first time fighting Blizzard in order to make a really great suit. And Obadiah has another way of trying to get this, by basically threatening to blow up Blizzard's brain if he does not go help his daughter, and you get that piece of technology from the Arctic. Now, of course, because Obadiah Stane isn't exactly very smart, Blizzard is very easily able to get rid of the one insurance policy Obadiah came up with, because basically when tech hits sub-zero, it stops working, and that's quite literally Blizzard's power set. That leaves Tony and Blizzard having to duke it out, all so that they can potentially save Whitney. Thankfully, this suit is actually built to deal with Blizzard, and while all that's going down in the Arctic, Whitney has literally escaped the hospital because she does not remember anything, and has put the mask back on because she's afraid that Tony is going to get attacked by her father again, because Whitney is flat out losing her memory. Now, it's worth noting that Blizzard has at this point taken the jet and is flying all the way back to New York to get revenge on Obadiah Stane. All of this is going on while, mind you, Whitney is quite literally dying. She will die fairly soon if Tony does not get the medicine that is needed for her. And all of this is not helping anybody's case when Blizzard is trying to assassinate Obadiah Stane. And to make things even worse, when Blizzard's dealt with, Whitney tries to kill her own dad again in an attempt to protect Tony. But when it's all said and done, and Whitney is going to be saved, Obadiah is still alive, Tony finally reveals to Whitney that he is Iron Man. It's finally something Tony does to open up to her, but unfortunately it is far too late.
Tony! I lost the ore.
Isn't there anything we can do?
She risked her life to save mine. Now I need to do the same for her.
So with Tony losing the ore, the only way he could save her is using what is left in his heart. Tony used the piece of his heart that is keeping him alive in his implant to save Whitney's life. But unfortunately in the process, the brain damage had caught up to her, and she literally doesn't remember anything before enrolling at the same high school as Tony, effectively wiping their relationship clean, their romantic relationship, and any sort of superhero relationship they had, wiping it all away in one fell swoop, which has to just be heartbreaking for Tony. Now, with all of that said, we're getting to the last two-parter finale of this first season, and we're gonna get back on track with the Makan rings. This episode starts with, of course, Team Iron Man plus Jean all looking for how to find the next fifth and what they believe to be final Makan ring, all before, you know, the Mandarin can find it and gets all powerful and everything. But before any of that can happen, when Jean does leave and head back to where the 10 Rings hideout is, he is confronted by the 10 Rings and his newly freed stepfather as the 10 Rings turn against him and take the rings around his neck off and hand them to Jean's stepfather. Now Jean's stepdad is in possession of 3 of the 5 rings. And while that's going on, Team Iron Man is actually taking a moment to look back at the Mandarin's past. We actually get to see the mantle of the Mandarin has been passed down from generation to generation, and even dates as far back as the Aztec times, which is where they believe the 5th and final ring is being held. And when both Tony and Pepper had decided to return to the armory after being done with their research, what they end up finding is that the 10 Rings is there looking to kidnap Tony Stark, as Tony was proprietarily the person who would help Jean Con the most when it came to searching for the Makan rings. Now, they are able to successfully capture both Tony and Pepper, but ironically enough, and what they don't know at this point, is that Tony is Iron Man. And so in capturing him and in blowing up his lab, they inadvertently destroy a majority of Tony's Iron Man armors and projects, all by accident, which is all going to be seen by Rhodey, who decided to hang back and do a little bit more research at the library. And this decision quite literally saved him from being kidnapped and pretty much saved the rest of Team Iron Man. So yeah, there is that. Of course, Rhodey is extremely concerned when he tries to contact Tony and Pepper, and he really can't, only to find out that they're both being held in captivity by the 10 Rings, all while the armory is up in smoke and Rhodey's worried about his mother. And then we get a funny scene of Pepper, who is just more than happy that she was right that Jean Con's stepdad is evil.
The Mandarin is my stepfather, Shay.
Are you kidding me? That's exactly what I was talking about when we first met!
Pepper.
Remember? I said Jean's stepfather was a suspected criminal, that he was supposed to be the head of the Tong. Oh, the FBI were right! So were the Magia, for that matter.
Pepper!
Wait, Jean, you knew?
No.
Jean, of course, lies about knowing about his stepfather being the Mandarin and his involvement with the Tong, who I just now realized I've been calling the 10 Rings this entire video. I'm not gonna change that, I'll just be honest with you all. But regardless, they are all being kidnapped by the Tong and, of course, Jean's stepfather, Jang, all to be forced to pass the next trial to get the 5th and final ring for the Mandarin. Did I mention that Jean's stepdad also has the 4th ring because he took that off of Tony Stark's possession when he kidnapped him? And while Jean and Tony are both trying to figure out how to deal with the brand new puzzle that is presented with them inside of this trial chamber, Rhodey is actually back at the armory. Rhodey is in the armory trying to find any armor that he can theoretically salvage in order to hopefully save Tony and Pepper along with Jean. And this will be the first episode that Rhodey actually finds his own armor mixed throughout the armory. Oh, and Tony and Jean kind of woke up Fin Fang Foom, and now they have to fight for their survival against Fin Fang Foom. with no help from Jean's uncle, who has all of his Mandarin rings, because, you know, that's gonna be a very easy fight. Regardless, this is the first time we ever see Rhodey suited up as War Machine. Now, this show doesn't have my favorite War Machine design, but there are parts of it that I thoroughly enjoy, such as the red interface, but I also really enjoy kind of the bulkiness of it, but that's also why I don't like it as much as well. Now, regardless, Rhodey is ready to take both his suit and Tony's suit all the way to South America, except in order to do this, he has to enter orbit, because it would take about 16 hours for him to fly there, due to the fact that the War Machine suit is quite literally not built for long-term flying. It is not a very fast suit. It is heavy, bulky, and ready for action, not for speedy flight. And while Rhodey's focused on that, Pepper was able to take the gauntlet off of the Mandarin masquerader, and as she was trying to get it over to Jean, Fin Fang Foom once again intervenes and is trying to kill Team Iron Man plus Jean. All this while Rhodey is trying to get to South America as fast as possible, going into space to do so, where his suit quite literally gives up on him and completely resets due to not being built for deep space atmosphere. And that's where episode 1 ended. It ended on a cliffhanger, and I'm just of course going to quickly jump into episode 2 for everybody here who, you know, doesn't want to wait. Now, Rhodey is able to regain control of his armor and basically free fall into orbit with using Tony's armor as a propulsion unit to his, and inexplicably his entire HUD turns to Iron Man's colors rather than his own suit's red color. I don't 100% know why this happened, but hey, it did. So just when things were looking at their most dire, when it looked like Team Iron Man was on their last leg against Fin Fang Foom, Rhodey came in clutch for the millionth time this season to save the day. And in the process, Jean finally learns that the man he calls a friend and has been working with this whole time is his arch nemesis, Iron Man.
What took you so long?
Don't ask. You guys okay?
Rhodes? You're Iron Man?
No.
That's what I was trying to tell you on the plane. I'm Iron Man.
Now, we get a really cool team-up scene of both Rhodey and Iron Man for the first time, and what would come to be a majority of the time when Season 2 hits. It's a fairly cool fight scene. But while all of that is going on, Jean is finally untethered from any sort of responsibility he felt to be a half-decent person, mainly because he feels as though his friends just betrayed him. And so he, of course, wants to fulfill his destiny. He has 4 of the rings in his possession currently, and the 5th one is right within reach. He is so close to being able to build the great world he believes he should be able to make. So when Fin Fang Foom is finally defeated and dealt with, the team first starts to mourn the potential loss of Jean, as he was technically eaten by Fin Fang Foom, only to find out that Jean not only lived, but is the one who just saved them, because Jean is the Mandarin. Which, of course, is an extreme shock to Tony and an extreme blow to him, as the Mandarin has quite literally not only been his best friend, but has also taken a majority of the things in Tony's life. As a matter of fact, without Jean and without the Mandarin, Tony wouldn't even be Iron Man. He wouldn't have a heart problem, and he wouldn't have lost his father. And to think the Mandarin was so close the entire time, being his quite literal one of his closest and only friends in his high school.
My entire life has been leading up to this moment. One ring was power enough to begin my journey. But with all 5 rings, my journey is complete.
But just when things started to seem even between both Iron Man and the Mandarin pulled out one last final. He tries to convince Tony that his father is still alive and that if he keeps fighting the Mandarin, Tony will never figure out where his father is.
Turns out I took the wrong Stark. Now let me go, or you'll never find him.
Now this obviously leaves Tony rattled, He pretty much hasn't been able to function properly the last few days, as he was severely injured in the fight against Jean. He's pretty much just been hanging out at home and resting, while Team Iron Man are somewhat celebrating their current victory, despite the fact that they lost one of their close friends that they all believed in, and as well that the revelation that Tony may or may not have his father alive due to the fact that Jean isn't always the reliable narrator. Now, of course, for Jean, this is also frustrating because he was told that after 5 rings were found, he would be granted ultimate power. But this is where we find out that there are actually 10 rings, not 5. And that's where the show leaves us for the first season, on a cliffhanger ending to get us ready for season 2.
With all of that said, it's time to welcome you to season 2, officially, of Iron Man Armored Adventures.
Now, for those of you who have watched both episodes 1 and 2, I think you guys understand how I feel about season 1 fairly well. I think it does a pretty good job of turning Iron Man into a teenage superhero and exploring what it would be like if maybe he had gotten his suit earlier in his career. It was a good way of trying to spin a twist on Iron Man's typical origin. And season 2 continues to build upon this pretty well, so without further ado, the first episode of season 2 is a 2-parter this time around. Since the end of season 1 and Tony's unceremonious end to his friendship with Jean Khan, he has been out living abroad for the summer before the next year of high school. He just kind of needed a break, especially from being Iron Man. And so Rhodey has really stepped up into his own role as War Machine and is no longer Tony's guy in the chair. As a matter of fact, Pepper has taken over being the person in the chair. And while Tony did spend all of that time abroad, we definitely see that he still is harboring a lot of negative emotions, especially pertaining to Jean and how that friendship ended when finding out that Jean was the Mandarin. As well, Tony really hasn't let go of the fact that potentially his dad is still alive. Tony had actually spent some time looking for his dad, but he ultimately comes to the conclusion that Jean was simply lying to keep himself alive.
He played me for a fool, Pepper. He lied, just so I'd let him go. He stabbed us all in the back.
Now, something season 2 does fairly differently is that it actually gives us A and B plots, true A and B plots, where we're going to see clips of Jean Khan and Howard Stark, who is alive, working trying to find the next 5 Makuan rings. The rings actually aren't a huge part of this second season, at least not for Team Iron Man. And so we will get minor updates on how the collection for the rings are going in this B plot. And we'll also see that if it's not that happening in the episode, episodes tend to have a separate B plot. A lot of this first episode is just used to set up what's going to be the new structure for the second season. As well, we get to see the brand new armory, which is built in the first Makuan temple that the gang explored in episode 1, seeing as Stain just kind of leaves it abandoned. As well, we're introduced to a few new antagonists and old antagonists that will be making frequent appearances throughout season 2. Specifically, one of the new ones being Justin Hammer, who is, for all intents and purposes, Tony's polar opposite. They're both rich, they're both wealthy and successful, they're both fairly smart. Tony is far smarter than, Justin Hammer will ever be, but Justin Hammer is also extremely egocentric, extremely bratty, and just overall, in my opinion, he's a fun antagonist for this second season and a fun opposite side of the coin for Tony. Now, I want to note something. Currently, the board is not the most happy with how Stain is running the company, nor how he is spending the money. And Justin Hammer sees this as his way of being able to come in and take over Stark International, potentially in a buyout. I just want to keep that in the back of everybody's minds, at least going forward. Especially because Justin Hammer ends up hiring both Whiplash and Mr. Fix in order to kidnap Stain, so that they can gain leverage when it comes to buying out the company. But in the process of both Iron Man and War Machine trying to save Obadiah Stane, Iron Man would end up getting gravely injured, and for all intents and purposes, this would be the last time we truly see the Mark I of Iron Man's armor being used in any sort of real capacity. Mark I is officially dead. And to me, that is kind of sad. I kind of know what season 2s of shows bring, new updated character designs and things of that nature, but I truly did love that Mark 1 of his armor. Oh, and Tony's almost dead too. Probably should mention that. Tony is barely being kept alive by his heart monitor, which is severely damaged from the fact that he got blown up by Whiplash. Now, something interesting and worth noting is we get our first real mention of Yinsen, who in this universe happens to be Tony's heart doctor, who ended up making the implant that he currently has. Not super important, but just like a fun little tidbit to talk about. Now, while Tony is spending time and currently recovering, Obadiah Stane does end up continually being tortured by Whiplash and Mr. Fix, simply for Justin Hammer's need to have Stark International. Justin Hammer hasn't been revealed as the benefactor, but if you've seen the character design and the red silhouette, I think you can tell. Now, Tony's surgery did end up being successful, and he will make a full recovery, but it will be fairly slow, and let's just say Iron Man can't be out of commission for that long. But before Tony can even get out of the hospital, nor have his family really get to see him, Justin Hammer comes in and decides to be a complete sleazeball, all in the effect of trying to get Tony on his side so that Tony won't take over the company, or at least will work with Justin Hammer once he turns 18.
Be the tech, we'll make billions. You'll just make weapons, Justin. I want to make tech that helps people, advances the world.
Do you know why I like Emperor Nero, Tony? He did what he had to do to take power.
Now, Tony obviously needs to get out of the hospital and get to what we see as Mark II of the Iron Man armor, which is sporting the more traditional triangular shape for Tony's arc reactor, which was far more popular at the time this show was around. Regardless, Tony and Pepper and Rhodey snuck out of the hospital, which they weren't supposed to do, but we get a very cool suit-up animation and we get a new look at a different type of armor. The armor looks extremely high quality from an animation standpoint. It's really nice and cel-shaded, and I think it looks wonderful, but it's just not Mark 1. But yet the rest of the show doesn't really keep this same cel-shaded design that the armor does specifically, so the armor does kind of look out of place throughout the rest of this episode and the rest of this season, as it just looks like a such higher quality product than everything else, which might have been what they were going for. Oh right, the actual episode I'm trying to analyze. So Tony and Rhodey both end up running the gauntlet. They have to fight Mr. Fix, they have to fight both Whiplash, who has extreme upgrades, and of course everybody's favorite, Blizzard. Now, on a more traditional sense, this episode, this two-parter, doesn't really have a lot character-wise. And that's actually something I feel happens a lot with Season 2, is there isn't a whole lot of character development for our already established characters, and there's just not a whole lot for them to do, and there's a lot of retreading of things that have already happened throughout the first season of the show. And I simply think that's because they expanded the scope of the show by a lot. There's less time for the main characters when we have to look at what Gene Khan's doing with the Makuan rings every episode, practically. This season does a lot more to expand the broader Marvel universe. And specifically, we spend a lot more time with the villains of this show, who I find to be far more interesting from a character standpoint, specifically Justin Hammer, who decided he didn't want to pay Mr. Fix anymore and instead would get him to work for free by threatening to kill him after he injected him with a virus. Now, I don't think the second season is substantially of less quality than the first one, but I think it's just in a far different direction than the first season was, and so I'm going to cover it a little bit differently than I did the first season. Now, the next episode in this second season is one of my personal favorites because it's a return of one of my favorite characters in this show, the Living Laser. Yes, this is the fourth episode this show has about the Living Laser, and it's all because Justin Hammer is an extreme megalomaniac who wants as much power as possible. Now, Justin Hammer has essentially brought the Living Laser back from being nothing but pure energy and given him a physical form once again. Now, why Justin Hammer has done this? He wants to harness the Living Laser's energy as a source of power for something he is building that I'm not going to tell you about just yet. Now, in the process of trying to harness his energy, They end up splitting Arthur Parks, or the Living Laser, into two separate entities. One being his pure goodness, his good side, and the other being his bad side. So essentially there are now two living lasers walking out and about, and that's gonna cause a couple problems. Especially when the evil laser ends up going to attack Tony almost instantaneously after escaping, and ends up doing some pretty good damage to Tony Stark's heart as he runs right through Tony's new armor. Now for Tony, this is the second time that he has put his trust and faith in somebody and they have betrayed him. He is extremely angry and upset. He believed the living laser had changed for the better and had essentially died a hero, but instead the living laser has come back to hurt him, and now he gets to meet a second variant of the living laser, this being his good side, who is begging for Tony's help, desperately wants his help, and Tony straight up refuses to help the living laser. Tony does this out of his extreme anger, not only at himself for letting himself get played twice in his own mind, but also at Gene Khan. Gene has burnt Tony so badly, he doesn't even want to be able to give second chances. He doesn't even want to hear the living laser's story, he simply wants him to get out. And now, of course, Pepper and Rhodey, being the two voices of reason, really do call him out on this.
I'm supposed to help? Right.
If the laser wanted to, he could have taken you down just now.
You used to help anybody who needed it.
Ask Gene. Maybe he'll help. Oh wait, no he won't. He's evil.
Tony has taken his experience to Gene and is now starting to apply it to just about everything. It's actually one of his few primary motivations throughout these first few episodes of the show. But thankfully, Rhodey does actually believe Arthur Parks and goes out of his way to try and help him as War Machine and wants to deeply understand what is going on with Arthur. Meanwhile, Pepper plays the other front, in which she tries to convince Tony that just turning his back on people that need him simply because he has had poor experiences in the past isn't going to do any good for anyone. As a matter of fact, it'll just eat him alive, because at his core, Tony wants to help people. Pepper really draws on the fact that Tony's father would have wanted him to go and help Arthur Parks, and that's what Tony's main motivation should be as Iron Man. And I think Tony forgets that a lot, and the show really just plays up that portion just to make some interpersonal drama between the characters, and they do it a lot throughout this second season, much as they did through the first, except I feel like Tony just doesn't learn anything, to be honest. Regardless, Tony does end up deciding to help, and he recognizes that there is more than one living laser. And oddly enough, Mr. Fix actually does a fairly smart thing, and tries to get out of there once he has the data that he needed, seeing that he can't really put the two pieces of the living laser back together. And he leaves Iron Man and War Machine to try and fix the issue before, the city potentially explodes, like always. And when it's finally all said and done, Tony has reunited the living laser into one body once again, letting him go and do whatever he wants to do, finally just being free.
I'm whole again. Oh, thank you, Tony, for trusting me.
Fix! Now, I really wish some of these lessons actually stuck with Tony, but the writing team seems to always default him back to being angry and angsty about his trust throughout the rest of this season, and I wish we could have seen some better growth on that end. But what this show sort of lacks in main character development, it definitely makes up for in the villains and the wider Marvel universe. This is Armor Wars, one of my favorite Iron Man comic stories, and one of my favorite adaptations to see throughout the show. It all starts when Obadiah Stane is losing favor with the board once again. They're pretty unhappy with how profit margins are and the way in which he's running the company. They are threatening to quite literally fire him and bring in Tony Stark early. This leaves Obadiah extremely desperate and needing some sort of leg up against Justin Hammer and his company from stealing the next multi-billion-dollar government contract. And Ghost will give him a way to do it. Ghost promises to steal the Iron Man specs in return for obviously being paid by Stane. And what's Tony up to? Getting bullied by his gothic classmates, because why not? The show's actually making pretty decent use of two background characters that we'd see a lot throughout season 1, just kind of in the background.
I'm telling you, that girl hissed at me. I don't even know her.
Yeah, girls don't usually hate on you until they get to know you.
For how Ghost plans to get the Iron Man armor specs, it's pretty simple actually. He ended up making a situation in which Iron Man needed to save the day, and then also needed to analyze a piece of technology that caused the problem in the first place. And that way, Ghost could figure out where Tony was and how all of his stuff was being kept at the armory. Which of course leads to Ghost not only figuring out who Iron Man is, that being Tony Stark, but also allowing Ghost complete unfettered access to Tony Stark's computer systems, allowing him not only to steal the Iron Man armor specs, but just about every single piece of technology Tony has ever worked on. Now Tony obviously cannot let those specs fall out of his hands into just about any other person's needs. For example, he definitely does not want those falling into the hands of anybody at Stark International that works for Stain, anyone who works for Justin Hammer, or just about anybody who could buy said data off of Ghost. But even with the help of War Machine, Tony is completely unable to stop Ghost. He just gets away, meaning he got away fully with Tony's specs, his identity, his suits, everything, every design he's ever worked on. And this leaves Tony genuinely distraught. He realizes that for once this doesn't just affect him, this isn't just a risk towards his own life, it's a risk towards Rhodey's life, towards Pepper's life, towards Rhodey's mother's life. Anybody in his life that he is close to at all, even Whitney, this affects all of them. Because now there is a potential for all of them to be attacked with Tony's identity being out in the open. And even though Rhodey tries to reassure him, it's not 100% effective. So Tony does what he does best. He thinks, and even though his thinking happens to be done while he's taking a test, not only does he ace the test, but he ends up getting the idea for how to try and take down Ghost. But it was far, far too late. Stain has already bought the specs off of the Ghost and already has all of the necessary tools to start making his own Iron Man armor for himself. And to make matters even worse, not only does Ghost show up to gloat, but he also says that he's not going to reveal Tony Stark's identity right now. Instead, he's going to wait until Tony turns 18, when he takes over Stark International, and then he's going to sell his identity to the highest bidder in order to make the most money possible. This is Ghost's retirement fund, being Tony's, essentially his identity. And what does all of this lead to? Tony once again wanting to make more and bigger weapons, all in the event of trying to take down both Stain and anybody that has his armor specs, which are just out in the open now.
Battle with Stain and Hammer, it's about to become an all-out war.
Tony was pretty much right, as sooner rather than later, Obadiah already has knockoff Iron Man suits out in the open. Two people, that would be Shockwave and Force, and they are both shown to be saving the city in their own ways, actually using fairly unique powers that we haven't seen Iron Man himself use. Not that the suits themselves are particularly impressive, they actually don't look great, but they have some pretty cool and unique powers. And now they are supposed to be presented as heroes and as though they're doing the right thing, but Tony is pretty much blinded by the fact that these guys have stolen his armor specs. As a matter of fact, he confronts them out in public and essentially calls them terrible, and is kind of earning the ire of being jealous. And even his friends call him out on this, and the fact that maybe he's not realizing that these guys can also work towards being good, and all he's simply focused on is the fact that they took his technology. Now, whether or not those specs were gained with either ill will or without, those guys are, for all intents and purposes, still trying to do good. At least that's what they look as though they're doing. Now, Tony, on the other hand, doesn't believe this.
These guys haven't broken any laws. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right, Rhodey. These guys could do real good with that armor, just like you and me. And maybe someday even...
What are you guys doing?
Everywhere Tony turns, there is just another sighting of Shockwave and Force, and so he ends up using the brand new technology that he built to shut down both of their suits, and in the process, Tony ends up making himself as Iron Man look extremely jealous and horrible. The people start to turn against him as they view Force and Shockwave to be heroes, not villains to be taken out. Rhodey and Tony once again have a battling of ideologies on this situation, and for the millionth time, not only in the first season, but trust me, you'll see it a lot more in the second one, Rhodey walks out on the team once again, upset by what Tony's done, and Pepper ends up being the one to help Tony, all to figure out that the two people running Shockwave and Force happen to be career criminals. Why Stain keeps hiring career criminals when he knows his PR is already bad is beyond me. And so at the expo in which Stain is supposed to be debuting the brand new member of his team using a Hulkbuster style model of suit, he ends up getting exposed by Tony Stark as hiring a bunch of ex-convicts in order to make himself look better.
Like criminals to me.
How did he find out?
Am I wrong?
Tony also proves the fact that the two had also started one of the crises that they had averted, all to make themselves look like heroes. And then Tony goes out of his way to be an actual hero in saving people. But even though Tony's Mark II is extremely advanced, there was no way he was going to win that 1v3 by himself until Rhodey, aka War Machine, shows up and helps save the day once again, so that the two characters can be together. Oh, and Stain nearly gets Stark International blown up when one of the missiles his guy shoots almost hits the entirety of Stark International's tower. How this man continues to have a job is beyond me, but regardless, this was all a test phase run for Stain's next big production, Project Ironmonger, which is essentially his gigantic suit using both Pegasus technology and Iron Man's technology. Now, the next episode is really far more of an episodic adventure, which this season does a lot. It's like a filler episode that's more or less just going to show up to kind of shake up what's going on currently throughout the season, break up more of the serious tone the last few episodes have had. And it also serves to establish that Tony Stark and Whitney Stain are officially dating. Now, Pepper doesn't exactly take too kindly to this because if you watch the show, then you'd know Pepper has a huge crush on Tony, and Tony either is completely oblivious to it or just straight up ignores it. And so to get back at him, Pepper decides to go on a date with Happy Hogan. Oh, and the main plot for this episode is that Black Panther has come back to, New York because more vibranium has continued to be stolen from Wakanda. Yeah, same plot as the first time he showed up. Right down to the fact that he refuses to ask for Iron Man's help or get any help from him. They literally just retread the same episode as last time, and it drives me insane. So instead, we're focusing on the B plot, in which Pepper pretty much blows off Team Iron Man so that she can go on her date with Happy Hogan because she's kind of mad at Tony.
Chance you can gather some intel while I do some recon tonight?
No! I have a date.
You're seriously going out with Happy Hogan?
I seriously am.
Now, I kind of find it funny that Tony is even bothered by the fact that she's going out with Happy, considering the fact that he is dating Whitney currently, but unfortunately Pepper's date is cut short when once again she's going to be needed to help mediate between Tony Stark and King T'Challa, because the two just cannot seem to get on the same page of working together until the end of the episode. Again, it's a retread. But this retread does serve to explain why there is more vibranium in New York, and that Justin Hammer has been buying this vibranium for a new secret project that he hasn't really talked about at all. This episode's B plot is honestly more important to the actual overarching story of this season than its A plot, which I find kind of funny, but that's a sort of pattern you'll see especially in more of these episodic episodes, where they're kind of just setting up new Marvel characters that show up, especially with the guys that return. And Pepper and Tony make up too.
Pepper, I'm sorry I didn't tell you about me and Whitney sooner.
It's okay, Tony. I get it. It's really no biggie. There's something I have to do.
And Pepper's relationship to Happy Hogan kind of doesn't really go anywhere outside of this episode, so I don't even know why they were paired together in the first place, even though I think they work as a couple. Now, the next episode does carry over directly from the previous one, especially involving Justin Hammer. Once again, Hammer is trying to secure the new government contract up for bids with S.H.I.E.L.D., so he is trying to present his brand new armor, his brand new technology to S.H.I.E.L.D. Unfortunately, the demonstration goes horribly wrong because Tony Stark is in his computer system and is currently tampering with it, which ends up leading to Hammer losing the contract for right now, simply because they don't believe in his demonstration, and they also just don't like his attitude. Now, Tony barely escapes once he has gotten into Justin Hammer's system, especially considering that he almost gets caught. The rest of Team Iron Man, that being Rhodey, is fairly upset that he went in there and didn't really tell him about it.
Burn, I know what I'm doing, thanks.
If you get caught breaking in, man, that would ruin your life, my life, Pepper's life.
Hammer is the criminal here, not me.
Now, while it is true Justin Hammer technically didn't pilfer off of Tony because Tony never patented the armor, I don't think Rhodey is 100% correct in the way in which he tries to tell Tony that this could ruin the rest of their lives. Dude, you are War Machine, you're already in way too deep. This is just kind of comes with the territory and you have to accept that. And while all this arguing and discussion is happening, Hammer ends up inviting Tony, saying that he knows his big secret, and he invites him to Hammer Multinational. Now, Justin Hammer really just thought that Tony was working for Stark International, and was hoping to swoon Tony away from working with Stark International, and instead to come work for him at Hammer Multinational. To which Tony then politely tells Justin to shove it, because his snails suck, and he does not ever want to work with Justin Hammer. And Tony once again ends up trying to get into Justin Hammer's security system, but this time he is met by the technology that Justin Hammer has built, that being Titanium Man, a mix of titanium, metal, and vibranium, all used to create a gigantic armor, one of which that he believes can easily take down Iron Man, especially because Iron Man's in his far weaker stealth suit rather than his much more powerful Mark II. Now, of course, Hammer would have definitely won if it wasn't for the intervention of both War Machine and Pepper remote piloting the Mark II to Tony, which is the first time we see her do something like that, and it also spurns Pepper into more and more wanting her own armor. That's just something to keep in mind as the season goes on. Now, both Rhodey and Tony end up defeating Justin Hammer because he never let his armor set properly. Hammer didn't let the alloys and the metals combine properly yet, and so the armor ends up extremely overheating when it is heated up, and essentially Justin Hammer nearly cooks himself alive because he wouldn't wait long enough. And then he blames it on Mr. Fix, and ends up killing Mr. Fix simply because he was too lazy to literally wait just a little bit. He's extremely impatient, not lazy, my bad. But he didn't really kill Mr. Fix entirely, as he took his consciousness and uploaded into a computer system so that Justin Hammer can keep using his intelligence for the future. Honestly, that's a fate worse than death. But regardless, the next episode is once again not super important to any sort of character development, but is great for expanding the Marvel Universe once again. We get Dr. Doom. That's right, Dr. Doom is in this show. And he also uses Makan technology, and that's how they explain away his more mystical abilities. Regardless, Stain has hired Dr. Doom simply for one purpose, and that's to help build the Ironmonger core. And, well, Dr. Doom and Stain are working on that. Tony has once again flaked on Whitney for dinner and a date, and so Whitney tries to set up another date as one last final chance for Tony to prove that he does love her. Now, Tony of course promises to go to that date and to be on time, but instead he decides to spy on Stain and Dr. Doom to try and see what they're up to, and he gets a pretty good look at the Ironmonger core. Oh, and he also tries to go one-on-one with Dr. Doom, and Dr. Doom absolutely dog-walks Tony without a single issue at all. Tony is absolutely powerless against Doom. And Tony also ends up figuring out that Doom double-crossed Stain. The Ironmonger core is going to draw enough power, and it's essentially going to become a gigantic bomb big enough to explode all of New York, all because Dr. Doom just hates New York, I guess. Regardless, Dr. Doom nearly blows up New York. Now, Iron Man, of course, goes out and fixes it, but in the process, he also tries to confront Doom, this time with War Machine, and the two get absolutely nowhere pretty much. Except Rhodey does show an extreme amount of resilience, and pretty much will that Doom wasn't expecting, especially from a guy his age. Yes, Doom now knows their identities. Oh, but the fight gets stopped because Doom has diplomatic immunity. Yeah, is that really how diplomatic immunity works? I would genuinely hope not, because Doom is a terrorist. But whatever. And with all that said and done, Tony realizes he completely missed his date with Whitney Stain. Like, completely missed it. And pretty much ended their relationship because he proved he cannot be there for Whitney at all in any sort of capacity, especially because he can't tell her that he's Iron Man.
Tony, it's over between us! I gave you another chance! Dinner! And you blew me off again!
There's something I want to tell you, Whitney. I need to tell you.
Yeah? What is it?
I'm sorry. I know I can't make it up to you, but can we at least stay friends? Please?
Can you be a friend, Tony?
Let me try.
And once again, we're looking at another episode that not only sets up some extra stuff for the Marvel Universe in this show, which is fairly big and expansive already, but also does a lot in furthering the plot for the rest of this season. Tony ends up sneaking into Obadiah Stane's vault once again, all in an attempt to get some of the data that he had stolen from him back. This time it is a tracking device that would help with the Ironmonger's targeting system, and Tony obviously doesn't want that to be the case. But he ends up running into Hawkeye, who ends up trying to steal said targeting device for another rich benefactor, that being, of course, Justin Hammer. Now, Tony ends up not only having to deal with Hawkeye, who is in this for the money, but he also ends up having to deal with the Black Widow. And now both of these characters, at the point in which they're introduced, are both considered villains. Black Widow does this for the thrill of it, and Hawkeye is doing it for his own reasons as well, but they're essentially both not on the right side of the law, at least not in this video. But Hawkeye definitely doesn't seem to be in it for the same reason Black Widow is. He even seems almost apologetic to Iron Man for what he had to do to him. Hawkeye doesn't really have his heart in this whole espionage and stealing from other people thing. It's just not for him, really.
I want back in the spy game, not stealing for fools like Count Nefaria. These jobs are nothing compared to the old days.
You know, Tasha, I'm involved in this because my brother messed up and got in deep. But you're in it because you like it.
And
when your girlfriend is an international super spy, that's just how things work. Now, of course, the two of them are attacked by Justin Hammer, who wants the targeting device and doesn't also want to pay. But unfortunately, the two of them aren't exactly the best at fighting, obviously, Titanium Man, so they have to hand over said targeting device. It's a neural interface, essentially. And Iron Man, of course, comes to confront them. Now, eventually, the three do end up teaming up, all in the event of trying to get back at Justin Hammer, who is using the neural interface to essentially play with MODOK as though he is a toy. Yes, Justin Hammer is now in possession of MODOK. And in the process of the fight between Iron Man, Hawkeye, and Black Widow against MODOK, Iron Man ends up not only being able to destroy MODOK, but also take away the neural inhibitor interface, or at least that's what he thought he was going to do. Because in the end of all of it, Black Widow not only ends up with the neural interface, but she also ended up abandoning Hawkeye, which is truly a turning point for him.
I'm just glad something good came out of this madness.
I'm sorry about Black Widow.
She's not all bad, you know. She's got a lot of potential. I've seen it. Thanks for saving my hide back there, Iron Man.
decides to go it out straight and to head out west, a slight nod to Avengers West Coast, and I think it was a pretty fun episode, but it doesn't really do a whole lot from a character perspective. As a matter of fact, Rhodey and Pepper were fairly absent from this episode. Regardless, this all leads us into the very next episode, which is Ironmonger. Essentially, Stain is continuing to lose favor with the board, much as he has the previous few episodes, and with Project Ironmonger not a full go yet, he has to do something to appease them, and what the board wants is more involvement from Tony Stark. They want Tony Stark more involved, not only for good PR, but because his ideas and his father's ideas is what kept the company in business for so long. Now, of course, Tony completely rejects this notion. He doesn't want to work with Obadiah at all, but he ends up being convinced by Team Iron Man that this would be a good time and idea to spy on Stain in order to see what he's doing and what he's working on. And as it turns out, we are fully shown Ironmonger, Project Ironmonger. It is touted as being used as a demolition specialist type of armor, but it's very clear that it is made for weapons and weapons development. It is made as a show of force and power and something that is hopefully going to win a military contract. And as it turns out, all of the buildings that Stain is demolishing currently aren't even uninhabited. As a matter of fact, one of the buildings is still inhabited by somebody who had worked out a deal with Howard Stark. That mysterious old man being Professor Zimmer, who happened to be a brilliant genius who was behind a lot of the technological developments that Howard Stark had helped work on. Now, his home was threatening to be destroyed, and of course Tony is trying to usher him out, but he doesn't want to leave. Not only is a lot of his personal work wrapped up in there, but a lot of his life is wrapped up in these apartment blocks, and Howard had promised that he could keep it.
Retired Howard gave me that old lab, but Obadiah Stane wanted it back, so he and his fancy lawyers declared me incompetent. Stane took my home.
That evil, rotten, bald!
Easy, Pepper.
Had become fairly personal for Tony. He wanted to see that Zimmer could keep the place that he lived, the place that he worked for so long, and that he could keep it, especially if it meant spiting Stain in some small way doing so. And while Tony does try to appeal to the board, he is ultimately, for now, unsuccessful in getting Zimmer to keep his home. As a matter of fact, Stain himself gets in the Ironmonger and tries to destroy Zimmer's building himself, simply because he wants to get his way so badly. Now, thankfully for everybody involved, Iron Man and War Machine are there, willing and ready to stop the destruction of this area, but it actually ends up being Zimmer and his technology that is able to shut down the Ironmonger long enough for the duo to save the day. And at the end of the day, Zimmer ends up getting his home back as the board votes in favor of him keeping it, and so Stain now has to pay him out. And it's just a nice little comeuppance for Stain, who rarely faces any sort of consequences. As well, we also get a progress update on the Makuan rings. Jean has attained the 7th ring in his quest for all 10, and Howard is leaving messages desperately trying to get back home. And while Stain might have gotten his comeuppance in the last episode, and Tony might have ended up getting a small win for himself, he continues to just take loss after loss, especially in the first half of the second season. Now, Tony has found Black Widow once again, but unfortunately, she doesn't have any of the information he wants or needs, and she ends up getting away when Ghost gets involved once again. As it turns out, S.H.I.E.L.D. has had a huge security breach and has ended up with them losing a bunch of their specs, and as it turns out even further, Tony discovers that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been working on their own Iron Man prototype, so to speak, and it's all legal because Tony did not patent his Iron Man armor. And of course, when Tony shows aggression towards this and being upset with the fact that S.H.I.E.L.D. is working on this, and for the fact that he broke into a classified place that he isn't supposed to be, he ends up being considered the fugitive that stole S.H.I.E.L.D.'s security stuff. And unfortunately for him, that means he has to fight a bunch of mandroids, and because S.H.I.E.L.D. is actually competent, their armors are fairly effective even when it comes to fighting Tony's Mark II. And recently, these L's have been dogpiling onto Tony like crazy, and it's really starting to affect him both mentally and emotionally. Thankfully, dude has a pretty good support system around him.
That Reed Richards lecture at the university? Deadline for tickets was yesterday. Richards is a science genius. I've been looking forward to his talk for weeks. I'm so lame. I'm... going? This is a lecture pass.
And with the advent of that small win, and Rhodey once again trying to hype Tony up into helping S.H.I.E.L.D. and also clearing his own name, Tony is ready to go back out there and retrieve the data that was stolen. Now, we get to have a quick little meeting of all the parties involved with this stealing. First, we get to see Black Widow and Justin Hammer, who have been working together in order to get this S.H.I.E.L.D. data, and as well we get to see Ghost, who is hired by somebody we don't know of yet, who is also trying to steal said data. Gosh, how many times are we going to see this version of Iron Man's stealth armor? It must have just been far easier to animate than his Mark II because we see it so often. Regardless, Black Widow ends up being left for dead and to fend for herself in getting the data, especially when Ghost takes it, because Justin Hammer is a sleazeball who doesn't care about anything other than himself, and Tony has to be the one who saves her.
You didn't have to risk your life for me, you know. You could have just left me.
That's the difference between me and your pal Justin. I couldn't.
We figure out that Obadiah Stane is the one who hired Ghost, as he now has all of the data he needs to continue perfecting his dominance. As well, Tony is for now cleared of all charges, but Nick Fury is just unintentionally being a jerk to him. And finally, to tie up any last loose ends, Black Widow officially joins S.H.I.E.L.D. as one of the good guys, mainly to avoid prison time, but I also like to think that what Iron Man did for her in saving her life has a little bit to do with it. Now, this next episode has almost nothing to do with any overarching plots, but is honestly one of my favorites of the season. Now, Tony himself is pretty worn out today. He's done a lot of saving the day as Iron Man, he's been up all night, and he has pretty much barely any time left so that he can get ready for school the next day. And so he comes into school completely exhausted, only to be gassed with some sort of suspicious thing that is being pumped through the airways of the school, which does at least cause him to get some. As it turns out, two of Tony's biggest ops, that being Regina and Andy, who are nothing but background characters in the first season and some minor speaking roles in the second, have decided to orchestrate a challenge for him.
You can call me Professor Irwin now. It's time to take the DATs, the Deadly Aptitude Tests. You'll have to think hard and think fast.
It's honestly a really cool episode that features very little Iron Man. They take two pretty much innocuous background characters that we barely saw in season 1 and we didn't see a whole lot of throughout this second season, and turn them into their own characters. It's actually something I really love and a concept I wish more shows would take into account. Regardless, the entire process of these new danger exams, or whatever she wanted to call them, happened to be the fact that all of Tony's friends and loved ones, at least that Regina knows of, are being nearly killed by her, all so that Tony can hopefully fail at something so that she can stroke her own ego and be better than him at just about anything. Now, Tony, of course, has to go through and save each one of his classmates, those being, obviously, Pepper Potts, Rhodey, Happy Hogan, which I just love Happy, and of course, Whitney Stane. Now, what's funny is that Tony gets at least one help from each person, and as it turns out, Happy ended up being the person that saves Whitney Stane's life because he actually pays attention in music class and because his mother's a musician. Now, Rowan is extremely upset with the fact that Tony continues to beat each and every one of her challenges. As a matter of fact, she had come up with a challenge that was completely unwinnable because it didn't have an answer. That was making a bomb. Thankfully, Tony and the rest of the group, thanks to the things they had in their pockets, were able to save the day and not all be blown to smithereens, much to Rowan's extreme disappointment, and so she sicks Andy on them. And as it turns out, Andy isn't human. Andy is a literal android that she built, because Rowan was a single child. Andy is the machinations of the family that she wishes she had. and this is where we get our Iron Man appearance for this episode. As well, we get a fairly satisfying fight scene between Rowan and the two ladies, that being Pepper Potts and, of course, Whitney Stain. It seems Rowan actually did deeply care for Andy, even though he was a robot that she had built. It seems that she had developed an extreme connection to Andy, as he was her only sibling. She believed him to be real, and she wanted him to be real. It's honestly pretty sad. She is a genius and could have used her knowledge to help further the betterment of everyone's lives around the world, but instead she was too busy being wrapped up in basically making Tony Stark look bad to do anything good.
Andy, the android?
She was an orphan. I guess she wanted what she never had. A family.
What happens to her now?
She'll be sent back to Ravencroft and kept under close supervision.
Think of what you and I could have accomplished together. All of your brilliance wasted. And for what?
It's honestly just kind of sad, but also we do get a tease that she might come back in future, except it's never followed up on, and I always hate when shows do this. Like, they give us these little teases that just never get followed up on. Same thing happened in the first season of the show as well. Regardless, it's time to talk about our last episode for today, and that is what I'm gonna call the fall of Obadiah Stane. Obadiah is once again testing the Ironmonger armor, much to Tony's dismay, of course, and so obviously Tony goes to him and decides to try and get him to stop. In the way in which Tony does this is he basically threatens Obadiah's life and almost lets Obadiah die as he drops him from a ridiculously high height, before obviously saving him because killing isn't really Tony's style as much as he would like to do something like that. And Tony's honestly just frustrated. He's almost ready to simply give up being Iron Man. He wants to take out Stane and take out the Ironmonger and simply be done with it. He feels as though he has caused more problems than he's ever solved by being Iron Man.
It's over. If I hadn't built that armor, Stane wouldn't have a giant, mass-destroying, invincible killbot.
It's not your fault, man. You can't control what other people do. Stop beating yourself up over this.
But he's also being fairly selfish in the way in which he's doing so. Rhodey doesn't want to give up being a hero simply because Tony wants to. But it doesn't really matter to him. He's dead set on doing this. And thankfully, in the end, Tony still wants to get rid of it, but at least he's able to get a win from Obadiah. Rhodey had been combing the data that they had stolen from Obadiah and had found the fact that he was linked to Ghost.
We can't be associated with supervillains. Stane, you're fired!
Me? After all I've done for this company? The biggest multi-billion contract ever?
It was all over for Obadiah. Between the help from Rhodey, Tony, and of course, Rhodey's mother, Tony ends up taking him down, getting him completely kicked out of the company and essentially ruining Obadiah's life. And that leaves Obadiah with only one thing, that being his daughter. His daughter believes that they will be fine and that they simply just need to move on, but Obadiah physically can't. He had just won the largest government contract ever that was set to make billions for the company, only for him to end up getting kicked out of it. He doesn't believe that it's right or just or fair. All this while Tony is quite literally prepping to turn in being Iron Man and to finally be done. The one thing he had actually truly become Iron Man for was to take down Obadiah, and with that goal finished, he doesn't see a point in being Iron Man anymore. But even when Tony's winning in this TV show, he's at least gonna take a few L's because Justin Hammer literally comes out of nowhere just to beat Iron Man up before having to go recharge his suit. And to make matters even worse, Stane has gone completely off the deep end. He has lost it. He broke into Stark International where they're keeping the Ironmonger suit and decided to not only steal it, but also to attack Tony's family. Obadiah is completely bloodlusted as he's willing to quite literally shoot up the Rhodes family home, all for the sake of potentially being able to find Tony. And unfortunately, Pepper Potts uses herself as a distraction so that her friends do not get shot. Of course, this prompts Tony to want to get back into his armor, all in the event of saving Pepper, who Obadiah has now taken hostage. But Tony, even in Hulkbuster, is not very much of a match for Obadiah Stane. He really isn't, and it's kind of unfortunate, but oddly enough, the one person who was going to be able to stop Obadiah and be able to truly save the day is his daughter, Whitney Stane. We've been shown multiple times throughout the first season that the only thing Stane truly cares about, other than wealth and status, is his daughter, even if he doesn't always show it. And so he does end up deciding to listen to her.
Don't hurt him! They'll lock you up! They'll put you away forever! Please! You're all I have left!
I don't want to be away from you, but I have to.
No, Dad.
In the end, Stane does decide to try and do the right thing, and he tries to stop the Ironmonger, but Justin Hammer, in a bid to completely get rid of Stark International's chances at getting a military contract by S.H.I.E.L.D. and getting it cancelled, has decided to take over the Ironmonger armor himself and is continuing to wreak havoc and destruction simply because it would benefit him. And to make matters even worse, because Stane is completely out of control of his armor and his daughter is right there in the vicinity, he nearly kills his own daughter and is forced to destroy the Ironmonger suit in order to try and get it to stop, which ends up leading to his own personal demise once Tony's able to fend off Titanium Man with the help of Rhodey. And unfortunately, this leaves Obadiah hospitalized and basically brain dead for current status. Oh, and they blow Titanium Man all the way to Pennsylvania too, so that's fun. And while Tony may have won against Obadiah, he won at what cost exactly? And he pretty much lost the friendship of Whitney Stane as well.
David Stark, none of this would have happened if it wasn't for you. None of this!
Whitney, I'm so sorry.
No, Tony, you don't know what sorry is.
Whitney blames Tony for what happened, and Tony doesn't really hate her for it. He truly understands that. And that's kind of where this episode ends off at, just the hope that maybe Whitney will come around some.
And with all of that said, you are ready to move on to the last video I made, which is all about the last half of Season 2. And for those of you who are coming back to watch, thank you for coming back, and let's get it started. Let's just start by saying the second half of Season 2 is so much better than the first half. It is much more cohesive, and as well, it is just so amazing. This second half of this season has some of my favorite episodes, and the second half even starts off pretty hot, with this entire first episode being focused around Tony Stark and dealing with his issues around what happened to Stane, along with repairing some of the issues he had with Whitney Stane, because the two have been driven even further apart due to the fact that Obadiah is now permanently in a coma. And to make everything worse, Tony's arch nemesis, Gene Khan, comes back looking for his help. Not only does Gene come back to torment him about the fact that his dad may or may not be dead and may or may not be kidnapped, he also is in desperate need of Tony's help. And how does Gene decide to go about this? It's very simple. He uses the Makan ring to trick Tony into thinking they're once again friends and basically brainwashing him, because that's exactly what you do to old friends, isn't it? Now, Gene has definitely been interestingly out of the spotlight for the last half of this season. We've really only had a few episodes going back and looking at Gene as a character, with not a whole lot of spotlight on him outside of being sometimes a B-plot in episodes. And it's really good to see him be the A-plot of an episode again. Now, I recognize why they made him the B-plot. He had to go out and find more Makan rings, but it is nice just to have him back on the A-plot, mainly because I like the dichotomy between him and Tony, especially now that they're not on the same side of things anymore. And as for the rest of the plot of this episode, it's fairly simple. It's just setting up the fact that Gene is continuing to get more and more Makan rings, and as well that there are more Guardians and Trials for the group to overcome. Although this might be one of my favorite Guardians of the Makan rings, simply because he is forcing each character to relive a traumatic portion of their past, and basically leave them powerless unless they have the willpower themselves to move forward. Each one of these Makan rings is symbolic and represents something that we'll get to much later in this overview of the second season. But it is nice getting to do a little bit of a peer-in both on Jean and on Tony to see what their greatest fears at this moment are, with Tony's being that Obadiah not only takes over Stark International, is out of his coma, but as well ends up turning his Iron Man armor and Ironmonger armor into a sort of police force. We also see a heavy emphasis on Pepper and her care for Jean. Even though Jean betrayed them, she still believes that there is the best in Jean and that he will do the right thing, even convincing Tony to go help Jean in order to get him out of his mind-melded state so that they can take care of the Makuan Guardian, which unfortunately leads to Jean collecting the 8th Makuan ring, hence meaning that dude is just getting more and more powerful. And that's kind of where this episode ends. And honestly, it doesn't really get much better for Tony in the coming episodes. And it just seems to really get worse and worse, simply because Hammer Multinational, yes, Justin Hammer, bought out Stark International and is now owning the entire company. Simply because Stain is off the books, the board needed someone to pick up the bill for the company after the massive disaster that was Ironmonger and Stain's rampage. I like to see that in this season we see a lot more consequence, especially in this second half, from events that happened at the beginning of the season. Oh, and another consequence of this is now Tony is completely flat broke. His entire trust fund has now been liquidated by Hammer Multinational,
under the company name, which Mr. Hammer now owns. You're penniless, Mr. Stark.
Roberta, is that possible?
But Tony, by this point, as we all should know, isn't exactly one to give up on a fight, so he taps into Justin Hammer's intel and sees that he might be having a fraudulent shipment of weapons, except that was all completely fabricated by Justin Hammer so that he can take down Iron Man once and for all using his newly refurbished Titanium Man armor, which has just been like so non-threatening this entire show. I mean, that suit got dogged on constantly, but it was really cool though, and I really do like this show's version of Justin Hammer. Regardless, we do get another subplot of Tony's been kidnapped and the gang have to figure out a way to save him, which I felt like was done way better in the first season because Rhodey wasn't War Machine and Pepper wasn't as proficient at using the Iron Man armor as she is currently via remote mode. But that's what made this episode important. It establishes that Pepper is starting to get practice with using an Iron Man armor, as well as establishing that Tony is officially broke by this point, and there should be some more weight behind it when his armors get damaged and or destroyed. As well, they once again dog on Justin Hammer, because that's just how it is. But the real most important part of this episode is the beginning of a brand new tech startup that Tony has decided to develop, so he can continue funding being Iron Man. That being Stark Solutions, a company focused on helping people build towards a better future, something Tony firmly believes in.
Stark International. But for now, today marks the first day of our new enterprise, called...
Oh! Circuits Maximus! What? It's catchy.
Well, I was thinking something a little simpler, like Stark Solutions.
Another part of the reason why I really like this second half of the Iron Man Armored Adventure show is it does a lot to change up the status quo of the show. And this really starts with the episode Extremis. Now, we definitely saw some status quo changes last episode, but this one will change up a lot of things. Now, if you guys are Iron Man fans, which if you've clicked on this video, I'm gonna say you might be, right? I could assume a fair portion of you might like Iron Man, then you know what the Extremis storyline entails, and honestly, I was very surprised that this show chose to adapt it, just considering how dark the story is in general. But it is one of my favorite Iron Man stories, and as well I think they do a really good job of developing it, even though it was only a one episode thing. In a basic sort of way, I just want to cover Extremis real quick. The entire idea behind this is this dude takes a derivative, at least in this show, of the super soldier serum that Captain America had taken. And unfortunately, this turned him into a literal freak of nature who is extremely strong, extremely powerful, and is able to suck the life force out of things and people. And of course, when Tony saw him on the street fighting, he does try and get involved in order to take him out. Unfortunately, Tony ends up severely damaged and gets his arc reactor severely damaged. Now, this episode takes a lot of liberties from the real Extremist comic, but I think it does so in a decent manner, and I do very much enjoy it. This episode also decides to finally reveal to S.H.I.E.L.D. who Iron Man is. S.H.I.E.L.D. now knows that Tony is Iron Man. As well, we get to see Black Widow more in a heroic role than we did earlier in this season. My apologies. Regardless, Tony is now completely incapacitated. As a matter of fact, he is told he'll never be Iron Man again due to the sheer amount of damage to his heart implant. And of course, Tony doesn't want to believe this at all. So he wants to try and take Extremis for himself in order to continue to be Iron Man, because he believes he can essentially get the dosage right so he doesn't turn into a vampiric monster. We also get a really cool reference to Captain America, which I personally love, because this show's world building was just fantastic.
It could turn you into a monster.
You're out of your skull, son. We're still in testing phases.
Did you see what Malin did to me out there? He's gonna do the same to you, to everyone.
Now, of course, Tony being Tony, he very much ignores Nick Fury's, well, any sort of warning anybody was giving him. Pepper, Rhodey, Nick Fury, Maria Hill, pretty much everybody, and decides to instead take the virus for himself and transform himself with the hopes that he will become better. Now, I personally really like status quo changes, especially in long-running shows. Sorry about that. And Tony does have a pretty decent one. He no longer needs to charge his implant. He no longer has to have an implant. Tony is now on a neurological level connected to technology, i.e. his suit can come to him at any time. He can map into technology whenever he wants to. Tony is, for all intents and purposes, superhuman at this point. He's no longer just a regular person. And it is in this episode that Tony finally, after 2 long seasons, earns the respect of Nick Fury, to the point Nick Fury even invites Tony to be a part of a team he's putting together. Spoiler alert, that's the Avengers, but oddly enough, they're never fully formed and or referenced in this show. Regardless, I think you guys know the rest. Tony obviously beats the man who took Extremis first, and he ends up going on about his time as Iron Man.
I'm putting together.
Thanks, Fury. But I'm not much of a team player.
Well, whatever you plan to do, son, just remember, S.H.I.E.L.D. could always use you.
Thanks, General Fury. I'm not sure what the future holds, but, you know, I'm okay with that.
Now, by this point in the video, you guys are probably noticing that this is fairly different from my usual style of content, in which I am far more analytical and much more willing to try and dissect these characters in these shows. And I'll be honest with you guys, there's almost nothing left to dissect. They haven't really, as characters, changed much from the first season. Sure, Gene Khan as a character, I'll have a little bit more dissection on him, but that's more towards the end of this video rather than the beginning or the middle. Instead, I'm going to treat this more as a retrospective in which I can highlight one of my favorite TV shows from when I was a kid, and that's kind of how I'm just going to go. So I'm pretty much going to cover every episode, and hopefully you guys continue to enjoy this. If not, that's completely fine, as it's not atypical of my usual content. But this next episode of Iron Man Armored Adventures is my favorite. I don't know if I've said that before, hopefully not, because this is quite literally my favorite episode, and can you guess why? It involves the X-Men. One of my favorite, or I take that back, my favorite Marvel group ever. This entire episode's themes are about discrimination, the discrimination specifically that mutants face on a day-to-day basis. And of course, as per usual, this is an allegory for the discrimination we see in our everyday lives, whether that be of black people, of women, or of just about anyone. The X-Men sort of fit that role in its entirety. And this episode does a really good job at trying to highlight this without saying that it's about real life events and just using the term mutant and it's kind of just a wink and nod as to you know what. And I also find it very interesting that Rhodey is the #1 character to defend Jean Grey. Yes, the brand new student who has showed up at Iron Man's high school, that being Jean Grey, going under a different alias, and Rhodey finds her very attractive.
Whoa, she's cute. Am I right or am I right?
He like the snobby stuck-up better-than-thou attitude.
Nah, I think she's just shy.
We are shown throughout this episode that mutants are definitely not treated very well, almost at all, especially in this universe. They're fairly new, considering the fact that Jean isn't at Xavier's school yet, and Magneto is fairly unknown, so mutants are very much ostracized. Now, what's very interesting, as I pointed out earlier, is Rhodey is very sympathetic to mutants and how they are treated. Now, part of me wants this to be because, you know, he knows what it's like to be othered as being a black teenager, but, you know, it could also very much as well be the fact that he thinks Jean is hot, and that could be motivation enough, and I might just be reading too deeply into it.
We saw everything. You're one of them, aren't you? A mutant?
And that freaks you out?
No, of course not.
And it's also worth noting that Pepper has to kind of play the other side of the coin, i.e. the very reluctant and almost scared citizen who has to try and understand what it's like dealing with mutants. Now, Pepper, I don't know, it felt slightly out of character that she would try to other someone for being a mutant and for being different, considering she knows Iron Man and a bunch of other superpowered heroes and villains. But again, that might just be a problem with Marvel in general, being that mutants are really persecuted and no other superheroes aren't, but that's a topic for another day. But I simply bring this up because when Jean does end up getting captured once again by Magneto, who is desperately trying to get her to kill Bolivar Trask, one of the US's senators, Pepper kind of makes the point of saying, let's just leave Jean and let mutants deal with mutant issues. Does that sound familiar?
You know, this isn't really your fight, Tony. It's between the mutants.
There you go again. Talking about mutants like they're so different from us. We're all people.
I know that. I'm just saying. We're still interfering.
Now, for the intents and purposes of keeping this section at a decent length, because I have written way too much, as I realize now, basically, Jean ends up going along with Magneto's plot, at least for a little bit, simply because she is kidnapped by him and he's threatening to kill her. At least until Team Iron Man shows up and they are able to help Jean, as Jean goes out of her way to actually try and save the senator, who pretty much wants her dead. And in the end, obviously Team Iron Man's able to beat Magneto and as well embarrass Trask on national television after he claims that he still wants Jean locked up, despite the fact that she saved his life. A fairly cheesy scene, but a very cathartic one at the end. And that's kind of this episode. It's my personal favorite because I'm very X-Men biased, I'll just be honest. Oh, and Pepper learns her lesson too.
Unless someone really ticks me off. You guys trusted me. Now I want to trust something to you. My real name.
It's not Annie?
No, it's Jean. Jean Grey.
I like that even more than Annie.
We also get another nice bit of world building, which is we're introduced to Professor Xavier in this universe, and it's the first and last time we'll ever see him. Now, for the sake of my own sanity, as well as keeping this video moving in a coherent fashion, these next few episodes that I'm going to cover are going to be more in a rapid-fire sense, and more along the lines of just being filler, that even though they are filler episodes, are absolutely amazing and tie up some loose ends that really need tied up. For example, this episode currently that you're seeing is all about the controller and how he has essentially trapped Tony within a complete social network, as he calls it, that he can control fully. Basically, it's a Matrix episode, and it's extremely cool, but it has really little to no bearing on the overarching story. It's a filler episode, essentially, but a really good filler episode, because it finally ties up the loose end of what's going on with the controller. As well, we get some really cool bits of Tony just being by himself for an episode, where Rhodey and Pepper really aren't there as much as supporting characters. And this episode in particular ends up with the controller being completely and utterly mind-wiped. Because of the device he used on his head getting overloaded, he doesn't really remember anything at all anymore, which is definitely a nice way to tie up the character, as he's had 3 separate episodes featuring him at this point. Oh, and we get a nice tease at the end of the episode that is probably never going to be followed up on, considering this show has been over for the better part of like a decade at this point. But the show does a lot of these endings that confused me as a kid and still kind of confuse me to this day, and I just don't know why they did it. The next episode is all about Iron Man 2099. Essentially, in the year 2099, a virus that Tony Stark created earlier in the timeline has pretty much caused the utter collapse of the entire world, along with most of their military. So the world's basically gone to shit because of one of Tony's inventions, and his great-great-grandson has come back in time sporting a really cool version of the Iron Man armor, might I add. Really fit the aesthetic of the show too. Basically, he came back in time to stop Tony from being able to create the virus, and so he was just going to straight up kill Tony, which is hilarious because he's a descendant of Tony, but he does recognize that. As well, a nice little tidbit this episode throws out is that because of all the chaos, Justin Hammer ends up president of the United States for a 3rd consecutive term, which is absolutely insane, because if you've seen this show, you know how just unhinged Justin Hammer is, and it's kind of hilarious to think he becomes president. Or is it really that crazy, all things considered? And in a pretty good twist, ironically enough, Tony's descendant coming back in time to try and kill Tony in a paradoxical way ended up causing the virus to be made and be distributed for the very first time. Now, obviously, he doesn't realize this until it's already too late, but by the time he does go back in time and decides to fix the issue, his life is effectively over, or at least this version of him is erased from the timeline. And honestly, it was a damn good episode. It just isn't really that important in the grand scheme of the show and the rest of season 2, other than just being a good episode, which is just something the second half of season 2 is full of. Oh, and Justin Hammer doesn't become president anymore. Instead, he goes to jail, where he belongs. Again, I'm seeing a parallel here, but I just can't put my finger on it. And now we're back to far more plot-significant episodes. That's what I'm gonna call these next few, which obviously start off with another episode about Gene Khan and the Makan rings. At this point, Gene has 8 of the rings and is desperately looking to get his 9th ring, which happens to be in Latveria, aka where Doom resides. Yes, Dr. Doom is coming back. And while Gene is off doing that, it is also worth noting that Pepper is, for the very first time, practicing in the Iron Man stealth armor herself, not simply remote piloting it. And she's not doing the best job, let's be honest. She's a rookie. Regardless, Gene shows up at Tony's doorstep extremely desperate and devoid of a majority of his powers, as Doom has just absolutely cooked him. And the only reason Tony even bothers in deciding to help Gene and getting this next ring back is because he finds out his father is genuinely alive and being held hostage by Dr. Doom.
Sick of your— Turn that thing off, Gene. You're starting to irritate me.
Dad? You monster!
So, reluctantly, Tony decides to team up with the Mandarin, aka Gene, and just kind of slowly feed him rings one by one, giving him just enough power to help Tony out, but hopefully not overwhelm him. While that's happening, Rhodey and Pepper have to deal with the fact that Dr. Doom is opening portals to dimensions beyond our comprehension in order to bring out demons and monsters that will essentially take over all of the world, because Doom is just so unabashedly evil in this show for no reason, and in general. Now, Tony's quest to find Gene and his father, along with Dr. Doom, doesn't really end the way he planned. He ends up getting captured in the same cell that his father's in, but at least Tony knows that his dad's alive at this point, even if Dr. Doom is continuing to experiment with Makan energy and is releasing horrifying looking demons that scared the ever-living shit out of me as a child. And unfortunately, the only way for them to get out of their prison and to be able to try and defeat Dr. Doom is for Gene Khan to get all 9 of his Makuon rings, leaving the back door and potential to get his 10th. Have I mentioned how amazing the Mandarin suit looks in this show yet? Like, I keep getting comments about it, and it's gotta be one of the top 5 designs in this show, and it's not even an Iron Man armor. Regardless, Tony does end up escaping as well as defeating Dr. Doom, but in the process, Gene has also made his way into getting his 9th Makuon ring, this being he's one more off basically. But on the flip side, Tony at least gets his father back, and I think that's a really big thing for him, especially because Tony is absolutely ecstatic.
I'm just glad to have you back, Dad.
Today we celebrate, and tomorrow we take back Stark International.
Now, this next episode is very important because it's going to be the culmination of Justin Hammer as a character. We've seen him throughout the start of Season 2, all the way up until this 21st episode of Season 2, and we've seen how he slowly started to just lose it completely. Especially when it comes out that Justin Hammer is being blackmailed. He starts going after a majority of Tony Stark's ex-villains. So we're actually going to see a huge drop-off in the amount of villains this show has. There are a multitude of them that are already dead, and a few that will be dying. But at the same time, we also have to deal with the conflict of Tony and his father trying to get Stark International back from Hammer Multinational.
Instant! Count Nefaria. Admit it! You're the one! It's you blackmailing me!
Blackmailing you? Between Iron Man's crime fighting and you taking the Maggia business, I'm ruined!
We also get to see just how Hammer is taking out each and every person he believes is blackmailing him, and it's honestly kind of hilarious and very in character for Justin Hammer, which is that he's turning them all into zombies, because what could be more ludicrous and over the top than coming up with a way to turn people into the living, walking dead? Because why not? Justin Hammer is just so mentally sick. I kind of love it. Like, as a villain, he's great. But this also just kind of spells the end for a lot of Tony's rogues gallery, whether it be Whiplash, Mr. Fix, Killer Shrike, and Unicorn. They're all pretty much going to be wiped off the map by Justin Hammer and his paranoia. It is fairly unfortunate because these have been recurring characters since the first season. They've been great to watch, but the show itself is starting to come to an end, and it's kind of fitting that they all get end goals. As well, Tony continues to get lessons in his own personal life from his father about the value of doing things by the book and by the law. We also see his father sort of disapproves of Iron Man.
But causes as much destruction as the people he fights.
But it's worth it, right? I mean, he saves lives.
That's what the police are for. Iron Man's an amateur, he's reckless, and someday he's gonna get hurt.
It is also worth noting that Tony hasn't told his father that he's Iron Man yet, but it is very much heavily implied that Howard knows anyways, whether Tony is going to tell him or not. Now, the rest of this episode is essentially just Tony and Rhodey trying to figure out a way to stop Justin Hammer from killing a bunch of Iron Man's villains, as well as try and stop him from enacting an even crazier plan, which is to turn the entirety of New York into zombies, because Justin Hammer is extremely paranoid and absolutely insane. And dude loses it even more when he is finally fully and completely outed as the terrible person he is. And ironically enough, the person that has been blackmailing him and doing all of these things to him has been Mr. Fix, who has been desperately trying to get revenge ever since Justin Hammer took away his physical body and made him into nothing more than a program.
Revenge for taking my body and turning me into a digital freak.
And of course, Justin Hammer gets his comeuppance in one of the most poetic ways possible, that being Mr. Fix finally getting his full revenge on Justin Hammer, turning Justin Hammer into a zombie, much like he's done to a lot of Iron Man's rogues galleries throughout this episode. And as well, Tony effectively kills Mr. Fix. Is it killing because Mr. Fix's consciousness was still there? but his physical body was gone, so is it really just a construct of his mind? That's a topic for another day, and probably a philosopher. Regardless, Tony's villains are pretty much eradicated. A majority of the rogues gallery he spent fighting is gone, but with Hammer being out of the picture, conveniently, Tony Stark and Howard Stark are both now back in control of Stark Internationals and are going to merge it with Stark Solutions, which is how Tony has been able to afford all of his armor and everything by selling off more inventions. Throughout the last few episodes, he hasn't had his trust fund. And the next episode, which you guys are probably going to be surprised isn't one of my favorites, is all about the Hulk. Yes, that's right. You guys are going to get to hear me talk about, God, we're coming up on 10 times I've talked about the Hulk now. Regardless, I'm going to keep this very brief because the episode doesn't hold a lot of weight other than setting up a small change in Hulk as a person. We're introduced to the fact that Hulk and, well, Bruce Banner and Howard Stark were very close friends and colleagues back in the day, before Banner's transformation. And so Banner comes to Howard Stark, now seeing that Howard is alive, and wants to ask for his help in hopefully being able to reverse his change into the Hulk, using a form of gamma radiation technology, all in the hopes that it would reverse his being the Hulk. It's also notable that Rick is basically completely absent from this episode outside of the flashback that Hulk decides to describe. I keep using Hulk and Bruce Banner interchangeably. I really shouldn't. It's Banner. Regardless, the entire experiment goes awry when not only does S.H.I.E.L.D. show up, but so does everyone's favorite military general, General Ross, who is effectively ranked above Nick Fury and is able to order Nick Fury around. I never thought I'd see the day, but here we are. And so essentially he is ordering Nick Fury to go after Hulk and to continue to pursue him regardless of the casualties and or faults. General Ross is pretty much hell-bent on destroying the Hulk by any means necessary, even if it means putting a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel at risk, something we see that Nick Fury has absolutely zero interest in, nor does it seem like Nick Fury wants to entertain this guy in the slightest. And so, of course, when Hulk ends up captured and is being held hostage at S.H.I.E.L.D. and by General Ross, Iron Man decides to devise a plan not only to get Hulk out, but hopefully get him to a state in which he can help Hulk get back to being Bruce Banner and have Bruce Banner perform the gamma irradiated, I'm just going to call it surgery, to hopefully transform him back into nothing more than Bruce Banner. Yeah, no, that plan goes horribly and Hulk is pretty much raging all throughout New York City streets, and Iron Man is trying to gently coerce him into going off and getting on the Gamma platform. And when Hulk does end up on the Gamma platform, General Ross, instead of sapping the Gamma away from Hulk, decides to overload him with Gamma, and in the process he's going to level the entirety of New York just so he can potentially kill the Hulk. And Iron Man is desperately trying to stop this because, well, this would level New York and kill a lot of people. Now, it is worth noting that we get a pretty cool scene from Hulk where he calls Iron Man his friend and saves him, and Hulk essentially takes the gamma irradiated blast himself, but he comes out different. Not Hulk, not Banner, but gray.
I would like nothing more than to squash you, General.
Someone help me! Please! No!
And as you can see there, highly intelligent. It's actually really cool to see that we're getting more than just one variant of Hulk, even if Gray technically came first. Again, this show's world building when it came to Marvel characters, it truly made me feel like the people behind this show loved Marvel, not just wanting to make this show a quick cash grab. Oh, and General Ross gets arrested. And Howard makes more sly remarks, essentially telling Tony and Rhodey that he knows they're both Iron Man and War Machine. The episode, very much following that one, is all about tying up one of the loose ends left, because if you've been paying attention, this show pretty much has 4 episodes left. So this one is all about tying up loose ends in a filler sort of way. Obadiah Stane meant a lot to Howard Stark at one point in their professional business lives, and Howard wants to help Obadiah as best as he can by any means necessary, even if Tony doesn't fully understand it. Now, when Obadiah is going to be visited by Howard Stark, dude is just completely missing. He's supposed to be completely comatose and just non-verbal in general, but he's out and about walking around as though nothing is wrong. Now, I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off. Spoiler alert, Obadiah is still in a coma, and it's all been a plot by Madame Mask, aka Whitney Stain, to essentially get revenge not only on Tony, but on Howard Stark as well. Whitney essentially gets one of Obadiah's old bodyguard men, who still works for Stark International for whatever reason, to hopefully inject Howard Stark with poison, that being O'Brien. O'Brien's such a douche, man, I swear. And then Tony is told that he must come alone to a warehouse in order to save his father and get the antidote that his dad needs, or he'll basically die.
Happy?
My best friend's in trouble. His dad has 2 hours left to live, and I'm stuck on the sidelines completely useless. I'm the happiest guy on Earth.
Hey, sarcasm's my thing, not yours.
Now this, of course, for once leaves Rhodey sidelined since the first season. He's really been an active participant. And so him and Pepper, feeling unfortunate about being sidelined, decide to try and press Whitney for information, and it goes about as well as you can imagine. It goes terribly. Now, when Tony does arrive to try and receive the antidote, it doesn't work out at all. As a matter of fact, he is almost gunned down to death, and Whitney is just extremely vindictive by this point. She just truly wants to see Tony hurting and in a lot of pain. He even gets Ironmonger out and parades it as though her dad is in the suit once again, knowing how much it will mess with Tony's head. As well, she nearly gets Rhodey and Pepper blown up in the Iron Man armory, simply because she does now once again remember that Tony is Iron Man. But what's really tragic about this memory coming back is she doesn't remember any time previous to that still. She doesn't remember what it was like when the two of them were close and dating for the first time, when she was Madame Mask for the first time, why she even became Madame Mask in the first place. It's honestly fairly tragic. Almost reminds me of Wanda from X-Men Evolution and how she felt to her dad previously before getting brainwashed. I wonder if they kind of riffed off of that for this updated version of Madame Mask. Regardless, she goes on a long monologue and basically tells Tony how she's been messing with him this entire time.
Playing you like a game. And this is game over!
I'm sorry, Whitney. The last thing I wanted was for any of this to hurt you.
But thankfully, at the end of the day, Tony finally stops pulling his punches. He stops treating Madame Mask like Selena Kyle and starts treating her more like Harley Quinn, if that analogy makes sense. He just kind of stops caring and is finally willing to turn her in, especially after the things that she has done consecutively and the people she is threatening to hurt at this point in Tony's life. Now, Tony is able to save his father, but it does also open his eyes and make him realize a few things. That even if his dad is alive, he still doesn't know he's Iron Man. And Tony is thinking that at this point, by how many villains know, by the fact that S.H.I.E.L.D. knows, that eventually he'll have to tell his dad before somebody else does, or something even worse happens to him. Because part of this is on Tony for the life that he lives, and his dad does at least deserve to know what's going on.
I have to tell my dad before someone else does. Before more people get hurt.
And we get another tease that'll never be followed up on. But I like to imagine that these are like the teases at the end of comic books, in which you're just assumed that the world continued to go on post the show being over. Regardless, we're in the end game now. These last 3 episodes of the show all directly tie into each other and are very important. They're also very Jean-centric, and that means I get to actually do some breakdown and analysis. Throughout the first season and second season, we've got to see a lot of Jean's past, a lot of the ways his mother has spoke about him being the Mandarin, about him protecting the world, taking care of it, and genuinely being a decent person seems quite lost on Jean in his almost evil want for power. He doesn't really seem to care about being much of a protector anymore at that point. Now, I do want to take a little bit of an aside just to mention a few things about this episode. This is going to be where the 10th Makuan ring is found. As well, this is the episode that Pepper finally gets her own costume. Iron Man suit, my bad. Yeah, it took this long for her to finally get her rescue suit, but damn does it look good. Regardless, I want to focus majority of these last few episodes, analysis-wise, on Jean. Now, getting back to Jean, when we do catch up with him, he has made it to the final guardian of the Makuon rings, who we happen to find out is a group of sentient lizard beings, yes, lizards live among us, that happen to be the original bearers of the Makuon rings. We actually get a decent lore dump about the past of them, as well as hearing how just unworthy Jean is, and how similar to the original Makuon ruler Jean is acting. The original man to hold the 10 Makuon rings, or lizard in this case, only really cared about world domination and cruelty. He cared about expanding his reach in the galaxy far and wide, and about conquering, almost in a Genghis Khan style way. It took a brave man who was willing to smuggle the rings away from the man who would rule them all, and he took them to Earth, hoping to continually breed down a line of successful holders of the Makuon rings. It also explains why Jean is the only person who can truly harness its power outside of Dr. Doom, and even then he couldn't tap into it fully, because he is of Makuon descent. Yes, somebody piped down a lizard, and I am genuinely concerned about the ramifications that had on my brain as a child. And to make things even funnier, Pepper is actually deemed the most worthy out of anybody in that room to gold the Makuon rings.
That Jean can't to wield the rings.
Thanks, sir, but I'm just fine without any alien DNA. No offense.
None taken, as I was not referring to you, but to the female human.
Ha! See? Not everything's about the oh-so-wonderful Tony stuff. Wait, what? Me?
Now, in basically no surprising fashion, Jean is able to achieve all 10 Makuon rings and gain unlimited power. It's also worth noting that he almost straight up refuses to fight Pepper. He doesn't really want to hurt her, at least until she strikes first. I think that's because they had a fairly close relationship to each other earlier on in the show. Now, Jean himself, upon retrieving all 10 of the rings, is ultimate power. He has everything he has ever wanted and dreamed for. He is now, in all intents and purposes, omniscient. He can see everything, and yet he still wants more. And he wants to not only take control of the world, but get revenge on the people that hurt him, i.e. Iron Man and Rhodey. He still wants to harm them. Jean never really grew up from being a petulant child who simply wanted power. He never grew past the trauma of losing his mother and having to deal with his abusive stepfather, Jong. And honestly, the person who points this out to him is Howard Stark, because despite all of the grievances Howard has with him, he still has slight empathy for Jean.
Strike me down. You're no great hero, no destined king. You're a power-hungry child who would gladly squash whoever stands in his way.
Lies!
This gives enough pause for Team Iron Man to escape, at least, but it also is starting to give Jean a bit of self-reflection in his own right. Basically, Jean has to be confronted with the fact that he's not the hero he believes himself to be, because Jean thinks of himself as the hero in this situation. And that leads us directly into the two-parter finale. Man, I really am a sucker for two-part finales. I just think they're such great ways to end shows, because trying to squeeze a finale into one 23-minute segment never truly works. Regardless, Jean starts off the episode by laying claim to the entirety of the world, claiming to be the world's protectors and asking everyone to bow to him, as he is the rightful ruler of the universe. And he basically threatens that anybody who stands in his way will be quashed and squashed, and that no resistance will exist. Now, of course, that doesn't sit right with Team Iron Man at all, nor does it really sit right with S.H.I.E.L.D. and or any of the other superheroes we've encountered throughout this entire show's run. But not a whole lot of that ends up mattering, because Jean ends up being captured by the original holder of the 10 rings of Makuon. Essentially, Jean is being confronted with the man who held power so long ago and who wants his power back as the Mandarin, and the dude's able to take it almost effortlessly from Jean, making him look like he is nothing in comparison despite having all 10 rings. As well, we get another lore exposition dump that is really nice to finally hear as we uncover the mystery of the Makuon rings.
Having conquered half of the cosmos, we prepared a great feast, but I was betrayed by a weakling who stole the rings and fled.
I think Jean sort of starts to see a parallel between himself and where he's going, and with this madman ruler who has been essentially taking over and conquering galaxies. Jean is slowly but surely moving his way closer to being far more like that than any sort of hero that he believes himself to be. Now, just for some general episode, and so you don't feel too lost, Team Iron Man ends up on the ship, and they all have to fight for their lives in a sort of battle royale situation. Now, obviously, Team Iron Man plus Jean are successful in taking them out, and so Team Iron Man is beamed out, but Jean is still being held hostage on top of the ship. And of course, this leaves Pepper fairly shaken, and she wants to try and tell Tony that she loves him. Yes, I haven't mentioned it a lot, but slowly the show has been building up to Pepper and Tony getting together, and that's something that's going to be actualized in this 2-part special, but is currently going to be interrupted by S.H.I.E.L.D., who is going to try and help form a group, as I'm going to call them the prototype Avengers, that are hopefully going to help save the day from this Makuon invasion. This team consists of Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hulk, War Machine, Rescue, Iron Man, Nick Fury, and, of course, King T'Challa, one of my favorite characters in this show. Oddly enough, no Jean Grey, but hey, not really too surprised. Regardless, that's the prototype Avengers, as I'm going to call them, that assemble to try and stop the Makuon invasion, and essentially save the day. And while footage of that is probably going to be playing in the background, I once again want to shift the focus a little bit to Jean. He's had to spend the last few hours essentially powerless, watching as somebody ransacks what he would call his own home, and essentially is trying to destroy it. Meanwhile, Iron Man is doing everything in his power to try and save the day, regardless of the outcome. As a matter of fact, Tony was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, as when they planned to blow up the Makuon people's home, basically home base, at least in a spaceship sense of the way, Tony was more than willing to essentially lay down his life and put it on the line to save the day, and I think that resonated with Jean character-wise, as Jean would never have to do something like that, especially not with all the power he has. Now, it is also worth noting that Tony's identity is completely revealed by the end of this episode. It's completely out there, along with the fact that him and Pepper finally get together. This 2-part ending felt really cathartic, simply because we got the wrap-ups to each and every character.
Can I just say one thing to you?
You could, but there's something I'd like to say to you first.
Huh. Another diversion, hey? Tony.
Especially for Gene Khan, as we finally see him step into the role of being a hero and a protector, especially because his storyline has been the most involved throughout the show.
Perhaps I'm not supposed to rule the world. Perhaps I'm supposed to protect it.
So,
Jean had the most to grow as a character on this show, as a majority of the main cast stayed fairly stagnant and really didn't learn much episode to episode, whereas I felt Jean did for a majority of the show. It's why he got a lot more special attention than, say, Rhodey or Pepper, despite me liking Rhodey, Pepper, and Team Iron Man as a whole more. But, as well, this show just ended on a really high note. The second half of the second season of this show was spectacular. It was actually a really good ending to a show and to a season, and it was really nice to see that this show got a proper ending, having a lot of the loose ends, either from season 1 or season 2, being tied up. Even though I was more critical of the first half of this second season, it's simply because the second half of it is at such a higher standard than the rest of the show, even including the first season. It was just far superior, and that's why I was so heavily scrutinizing the first half of this season, because it just felt bland in comparison, and it honestly just felt like a bunch of filler. So that was my complete retrospective on Iron Man Armored Adventures. I covered this show over the course of 4 months, and honestly, it was one of the greatest experiences I've had as a creator. Iron Man Armored Adventures actually released at a time where I was old enough as a child to watch it as an actual kid when it was coming out, and watching episodes on Nicktoons as they were being released. So I have a special place in my heart for this show. I remember taping episodes and then watching them before school in middle school because I'd get up like a half hour early so I could watch TV before classes. And that was well past when the show was done airing. It made a very big mark on how I enjoy Iron Man and how I look at him as a character. This show means a lot to me, so I was really excited to cover it all. And also I figured it would be nice and convenient, especially for brand new viewers, for them to be able to watch this entire recollection in its entirety, or in case some of you guys just wanted to watch again, of which I truly appreciate. Now, of course, this also comes with the fact that it is the end of the video, and so now it's time for me to do my YouTuber thing. If you like the video, please leave a like, it helps out the channel a lot. If you want to subscribe, it's free, you can always unsub later. If you want to dislike, please tell me in the comments below why you disliked. Constructive criticism helps me make better videos overall. And as well, if you want to go to my Patreon, it's $1 a month. You'll get access to my Discord where you can interact with me, and it's where I also host weekly watch-alongs of movies with my community. You also get to see each one of these videos early and unedited, which means no freeze frames, no text that pops up on the screen, nothing. And as well, that's all for $1 a month. And if you do join at the $5 above tier, you get shouted out at the end of each and every one of my videos, just like these lovely people here. So shout out eSibert13, shout out Gabriel LaFonte, shout out Transgers1, Video Gamer 75, shout out Golden Boy 420, Dakota Rawson, Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You all are amazing, and I hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.